Well, hello everybody. How y'all doing? Good, I hope. So today we're going to be making a mask, obviously. We were going to make it at paper mache, but I think we're going to sculpt it. Probably the way to go. Methinks. We're going to run an ad. Okay, whatever. We're not. Fuck that shit. All right. So, what mask are we going to make? That's the thing. Oh. Bum bum ba bum 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 bum. I'm just looking at pictures of stuff. Let's do. We could do a preceptor. I don't know. Do 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 do. I'm kind of liking the old Ray Lucaria dude masks. The stone ones, you know? Hmm. Whoops. Okay, so let's do Carollos. Carollos, right? Yeet. What's up, Bird Squirt? Just in time. Let's see. Carollos. Yes. So we're gonna get this one right here. Let's get a picture of it. Oh, that's a tiny picture. We need a big picture. Big picture. Rolos, glintstone crown. Can't seem to find a good picture of it. They're all teeny. Teeny tiny. All right, this is the one we're making. Put that right there. You guys can see. Or maybe down here. Down here should be good. Okay. So, we're also going to watch these videos while we make this thing.
Our story doesn't begin between.
So I don't have to do shit.
It ends in the cosmos, far away, with an alpha god called the Greater Will.
Well, let's turn it down a little bit. Oh.
Alpha gods mentioned in Elden Ring. You can think of these kind of like the great ones of Bloodborne, distant beings.
Some great, some small, that together. Our story doesn't begin in the lands between.
All right, how's the sound?
It begins in the
you guys hear the
cosmos,
video?
far away, with an outer god called the Greater Will. There are a lot of outer gods mentioned in Elden Ring. You can think of these kind of like the great ones of Bloodborne. They're distant beings, they're all-powerful, and they're quite unknowable by design. But many of these outer gods want to make their presence felt in the world. The Greater Will, maybe most of all. To this end, it sent a golden star hurtling towards the lands between.
I need to get a cup of
The
water.
Golden Star's incantation tells us that this golden star was bearing a beast, an Elden beast. The Elden Remembrance calls it a vassal beast of the Greater Will. If you didn't know, a vassal is someone who holds land on behalf of their overlord. Obviously, this is fitting in this case, because the Elden Beast occupied the lands between on behalf of the Greater Will, and was a living incarnation of the concept of order. As such, this beast would later become the Elden Ring. The Elden Ring itself is made up of runes of power, some great, some small, that together represent a sort of logic for the world to follow. Thus, the Elden Ring represents order. The true nature of this order is a subject of constant debate and research undergone by fundamentalists. But two of the key fundamentals are the laws of causality and regression. You can think of the
Little bit of
law of
wah-wah.
causality as cause and effect, where actions have consequences, and those consequences are new causes that branch
How am I
out
going to do their
into
beards?
infinity. These are the relationships between things.
We'll
Then
figure it
there's
out.
the law of regression that states that all things
will figure it
eternally yearn
out.
to converge and return to their roots. Fittingly, then, the Elden Ring is housed within the Erd Tree, which towers over the lands
Back
between.
bowl first.
But it's very important to stress that life in the lands between did not begin with the Erd Tree, the Elden Ring, or the Elden Beast. No, the lands between were occupied well before the Greater Will came. There were other beings here. There were other factions here. There were other gods here. And there was even another great tree here before the Erd Tree. And this is where a huge twist regarding the Erd Tree comes in. So, there are incantations in the game called Aspects of the Crucible. According to their descriptions, these are manifestations of the Erd Tree's primal vital
You
energies.
get another damn
And I
camera.
quote, they are an
Using my
aspect
phone
of the
sucks. It's
primordial
really choppy.
crucible where all life was once blended together. But how could all life be blended together in the Erd Tree if the Erd Tree appeared after life existed? Well, there can only be one answer, right? That the Erd Tree is a parasite, and it took over a tree that existed here before. This ancient tree was called the Great Tree. So the Great Tree was almost certainly the location of this primordial crucible, and it must have been a very powerful primordial force for the Greater Will to have commandeered. It might even be the reason the Lands Between is important to the Greater Will in the first place. It also explains why spells and enemies related to the Great Tree's crucible would eventually be looked down upon. For example, the knot talisman is fashioned from a knotted vestige of the crucible, and it was
So
considered
we have
a
this
signifier
ridge for the
of divine
nose.
in ancient
Let's go
times,
ahead.
but is now increasingly disdained as an impurity as civilization has
Get some
advanced.
shit.
Enemies related to the crucible are the Omen, the Misbegotten,
So we don't have to
and the Crucible
waste
Knights,
a whole
and
bunch of clay,
all
you
three
know?
of them would be shunned, enslaved, or imprisoned. Those who speak for the Erd Tree don't want you to know its roots, so to speak. According to the spell, protection of the Erd Tree,
go like
in the beginning
that.
everything was in opposition to the Erd Tree, but through countless victories in war, it became the embodiment of order.
In Marika's own words,
Actually,
the
their
Erd Tree
forehead's pretty
governs all.
flat, huh?
The choice is thine.
It's just a big
Become one with the
pointy
order,
nose thing.
or divest thyself of it. To wallow at the fringes, a powerless upstart.
But the Greater Will needed more than a big tree. It needed loyal agents in the lands between. To this end, it has the Two Fingers, who are its envoys. The Two Fingers heirloom has a weird picture of them, but it reads, of course, fingers cannot speak, yet these are eloquent. Persistently they wriggle, spelling out mysteries in the air. Thus did we gain the words of our faith. These words are interpreted by the finger readers. These are the undying old crones that you would have found throughout the lands between. They pass down the wisdom of the Two Fingers, or at least they used to.
Your fingers, please, your fingers. I can't read them.
Most of them appear to have lost their purpose, and they're desperate to read your fingers and tell you annoying riddles, since their two fingers are likely dead. And yes, of course, there are multiple sets of Two Fingers. You would have
Alrighty.
found their corpses on the tops of the divine towers. Atop these towers, you loot the fingers in order to activate the true power of a great rune. Specifically though, you are giving benediction back to your great rune. You're taking a blessing back from the two dead fingers, essentially.
Let's turn
This
these
is
damn
just one of the
subtitles
many
off.
blessings that the Two Fingers can bestow, and my point is kind of that the Two Fingers clearly have more than just influence. They have real power on some level. The Greater Will needs these powerful envoys and agents because, while it's obviously incredibly powerful, it does seem limited by a few things. First is space. The Greater Will didn't come to the lands between itself, it sent an Elden Beast to do its bidding instead.
Yeah, he's a little
Second
bitch.
is time. There is a moment later in the game where your pair of Two Fingers go still because they're forced to commune with the Greater Will for guidance.
When they are finished, the fingers will again offer their guidance. but thousands, if not tens of thousands, of moons must first pass. No matter for me. But you, how will you ever manage to wait?
So the Greater Will needs a physical manifestation of order. It needs envoys to convey its will, but what it also needs is a god. Introducing Marika the Eternal. I have this utterly enormous mind map of Elden Ring's lore, and there's a reason she's at the center. She's essentially the equivalent of Gwyn from Dark Souls, except unlike
maybe
Gwyn,
we should
Marika
put some
didn't just crawl out
paper
of the
under
dark
here for
and
cheeks.
find power. To an extent, it seems like she earned it.
Or is
We
that-
don't know much
no,
about
no,
her
no, no, no.
origins, except
See,
that she is of the
this is
Newman
already too
race,
big.
which is actually an origin
We're
that
doing
you can
stupid
choose
things.
in the character selection screen. Newmen come from outside the lands between, and are supposed descendants of denizens of another world, long-lived but seldom born. At some point, Marika was chosen as an Empyrean. What is an Empyrean? Well, an Empyrean is a being chosen by the Fingers as a candidate for godhood. As an Empyrean, Marika receives
go.
the aid of a shadow to do
Better.
her bidding. So what is a shadow? Well, it's a wolf, shadowbound to its Empyrean by the two fingers. Luna Princess Rani is another example of an Empyrean with a shadowbound beast. You would have met Blythe. These creatures are the Empyrean's very own shadow. They are completely loyal to their needs and, by definition, incapable of treachery. Marika's shadow was a beast called Malakath. Every Empyrean uses their shadow
We're
in
gonna use
different
this
ways, but
tape
Marika's
stuff.
sole need of her shadow was as a vessel to lock away destined death. So what is destined death? Well, according to Enya, it's the rune of death.
The rune of death goes by two names. The other is destined death.
We mentioned earlier that the Elden Ring is made up of runes, and
Oh, that's
at
not
some
gonna work.
point, maybe when she was chosen as a god, Marika
yeah, well,
plucked
hold on.
the rune of death
So we'll go like
from
this.
the Elden Ring. She gave the rune of death to
And
Malakath,
we'll
her
stick it
totally
right
loyal
here.
shadow, who bore a black blade imbued with this rune.
Something like that.
Kind of genius, really.
No,
In a
that's-
single
that's
act,
terrible.
she removed the concept of death from the lands between,
That is
while
terrible.
also commanding total control of death through her shadow, who could deliver it at her
We
will.
need like tape or something.
Now, some of you might be asking, if death is removed from the lands between, how come I can kill this dog? First off, shame on you. Second, from a lore point of view,
That's
that
not a
dog
dog.
isn't really dead. It's simply in the process of its spirit, or its soul, returning to the Erd Tree. Catacomb dungeons, for example, are specifically constructed near the roots of the Great Tree for this reason, so that the Erd
There we
Tree
go.
can
There we
reabsorb
go.
their
Much
ashes
better.
back into it. This process replaced the concept of a death that you were destined to have. But this random spirit outside of a catacomb dungeon says it best.
Smash.
As another
We seem to
example
put
of
a lot
this
of the tape
theory,
stuff.
when you kill a major boss, you receive a remembrance of them. These are spirits, and they are hewn into the Erd Tree. In this way, thanks to the Erd Tree's grace, their spirits are immortalized, in a sense. This new form of death also explains what's happening when you summon spirits.
From ash and return to the Erd Tree.
However, some spirits never return to the Erd
Nice.
Tree, and they rise within death as corpses or
Nice.
skeletons instead.
It's vaguely a face.
So this was the new order, and it's important to stress that it was in this moment, when the rune of death was removed, when destined death was taken, this is when order became the Golden Order.
The forbidden shadow plucked from the Golden Order upon its creation.
Specifically, this was Marika's Golden Order. So not only did she become a god and a vessel for the Elden Ring, she became renowned as Marika the Eternal for her removal of destined death. It was a
Alright.
huge part of her character
So we've
and
got a
her
base.
reign as well. However, Marika had more than just death to conquer. She had wars to fight, as the world was occupied by many forces that could threaten her Golden Order. There was war with the Stormlord, who likely ruled over Stormvale. And there was a war with the Giants, who were masters of a flame that could burn the Erd Tree. There There was war with the ancient dragons, who incidentally had stones that could twist time and thus slay a god. And finally, there was war brewing with the Carrion royalty, who had previously obeyed laws which contravened the Golden Order. Thus, sort of similar to how the Greater Will needed an Empyrean to enforce its will, Marika herself needed someone to wage war. So, there was to be a husband, a consort, an Elden
Husbando.
Lord. The man chosen was Horalu, a ferocious warrior who became known as the Lord of the Battlefield. His crown was warranted with strength, and
It was such a
while
fun
it was
fight.
for this strength that Marika married him, he was also required to take a vow to conduct himself as a lord. To suppress the ceaseless lust for battle that raged within, Horalu took the beast regent Sarosh upon his back. You'll notice this is another example of a beast being given for the purpose of serving order. Thus, in this moment, he went
a
from
good
being
boy.
Horalu, warrior, to Godfrey, the first Elden Lord, consort to Queen Marika, and a certified demigod. Godfrey and Marika had 3 demigod children together. There was Godwyn the Golden, who you saw being killed in the opening trailer, and there were also the reviled Omen twins, Morgoth, who guards the Erd Tree, and Mohg, who became Lord of Blood. You might think that Godric was another demigod child, but he actually wasn't. Instead, he was probably descended from Godwyn. Anyway, we'll talk about the demigods more in detail in another video, so subscribe for that. But for now,
Yeah,
just
subscribe
know
to
that
that.
Godfrey and his offspring were the first demigods, henceforth known as the Golden Lineage. In his wars, Godfrey led his 16 Crucible Knights into battle, who were named so for they fought with the primordial powers of the Erd Tree. Their incantations were aspects of the Crucible itself, and they likely fought giants, dragons, the Stormlord, and more to usher in their age, the age of the Erd Tree.
In Marika's own words, "Hark, brave warriors. Hark, my Lord Godfrey. We commend your deeds. Guidance hath delivered ye through each ordeal to the place ye stand. Put the giants to the sword and confine the flame atop the mount. Let a new epoch begin, an epoch glistening with life. Brandish the Elden Ring for the age of the Erd Tree."
The Erd Tree would go on
Ye.
to be largely seen as a blessing for all of those in the lands between, especially those close to it in Leyndell, the capital city of the Erd Tree.
The
tree
Age of the
bestowed
Erd Tree
blessings.
ending
For
is pretty
example,
boring,
the
though.
dew that dropped from its branches were like jewels. It loomed overhead as a
I'm pretty
constant
sure most
reminder
people
of
prefer
order,
Ronnie's
and its roots reached far
Age
and
of the
wide,
Moon
relieving many of the burden of death.
ending.
In fact, Erd Tree burial was one of the highest honors a hero could receive. One by one, the previous factions of the world fell. The giants were put
Okay.
to the sword.
They
and
do
their
have,
fell
like, a
god was
big
killed by Marika herself.
Flat
The
nose.
ancient dragons broke down the walls of Leyndell, but met fierce retaliation. However, I think the House of the Erd Tree encountered the most trouble against the land to their southwest, Leonia. Here, the House of the Moon repelled their offensives time and time again. And I mean that literally, because there was not just one, but 2 wars fought here. And in both of these, there was no victory for the Golden, nor for the Moon. And I
think I'm gonna
suspect
have to
it
put
was
the
probably
nose
because
up
of these
here.
monsters. These damn things can snipe you from like a mile away, and it's bullshit. Actually, it was probably because of the Carrion Knights, who, according to their weapons, were able to wield sorcerous battle skills, and despite
So that I can
numbering
fit the
fewer
little
than 20,
beard
this
foopies.
power made them a match for even the champions of gold in battle. These enchanted knights were anointed by the Lunar Queen, a young astrologer who went on to establish the House of Caria as royalty in this land. With her bewitching lunar magic, she won over the Academy of Raya Lucaria, where glintstone
Big
sorcery
old
was
chunk
studied,
for the hair
and
here eventually.
united. The Carrion royal family and the learned scholars of Raya Lucaria defended their home from the golden aggressors. At the head of this great golden army was Radagon.
Lord Radagon was a great champion, possessed of flowing red locks. He came to these lands
Should probably
at the
start
head
from the
of a
beard and
great
work our way up
golden
as it
host.
overlays.
When he met Lady Renala in battle,
These 2 champions clashed, fell in love, and joined their houses.
Radagon once cleansed himself with celestial dew.
It might be
repented
worth
his
stuffing
territorial
this up down
aggressions,
here on the bottom,
and swore his
so I don't have
love
to use 10 pounds of
remember.
clay
The order of the Erd tree
to build out
and the
the
fate of the moon were conjoined, and all the
beard.
wounds of war forgiven.
You might think it strange that the Greater Will would permit this union.
I think that's
but
exactly
it's
what
not
I'm going to
too
do,
odd,
actually.
all things considered. As with most From Software games, sorcery and faith are just two sides of the same coin, and both of these powers stem from the cosmos. Radagon and Renala were known to have 3 children
Basically,
together. Lunar Princess Rani, who
just
inherited
shove
her
this
mother's
whole wedge up
propensity
under there.
for lunar magic. Radan, who took after his father Radagon and would go on to master
just needs a rough
gravitational
shape,
magic,
you know?
and Rykard, who pioneered new hex
Cram that
sorceries
in.
and would go on to feed himself to a
Cram.
great serpent. It follows that at some point after this, Marika began to harbor doubts about the Golden Order that she had had a hand in creating.
In Marika's own words, I declare mine intent to search the depths of the Golden Order through understanding of the proper way. Our faith, our grace is increased. Those blissful early days of blind belief are long past. My
alrighty.
comrades, why must ye
Smash
falter?
that up in there.
And it's at this point that we should talk about Marika's motivations, her character. This is surely going to be one of those huge points of debate in the coming years, but for now, my working theory is that she wanted to discover the truth behind order and the truth behind the greater will, and she
Yes,
believed
they have
that bonds had to be broken.
An
so that they could
overwhelming
be better
beard
understood.
consumed by their
She
hair.
believed that there was great meaning to be found in hardship.
Queen Marika has high hopes for us, that we continue to struggle unto eternity.
For Lord Godfrey, his struggle ended at the end of his campaigns. According to his armor, he led the war against the giants, faced the Storm Lord alone, and then there came a moment when his last worthy enemy fell, and it was then, as the story is told, that the hue of Lord Godfrey's eyes faded.
Yeah,
In truth,
right
he was
here.
robbed of his grace. Then Marika sent him away.
My lord, and thy warriors, I divest each of thee of thy grace. With thine eyes dimmed, ye will be driven from the lands between.
He has some rough
Ye will
shapes.
wage war in a land afar, where ye will live and die.
This became known as the Long March of the Tarnished, as Godfrey and his tarnished descendants walked away from the lands between. But Queen Marika absolutely had a plan here, that Lord Godfrey and his descendants would one day return stronger, having struggled outside of grace.
Then, after thy death, I will give back what I once claimed, return to the lands between, wage war, and brandish the Elden Ring, grow strong in the face of death. Warriors of my lord, Lord Godfrey.
Soon after, she found a new husband. Either that or a new husband was found for her.
When Godfrey, first Elden Lord, was hounded from the lands between, Radagon left Renala to return to the Erdtree capital, becoming Queen Marika's second husband and king consort, taking the title
Looking for my
of
tools.
second Elden Lord. The mystery endures to this day as to why Lord Radagon would cast Lady Renala aside, and moreover, why a mere champion would be chosen for the seat of Elden Lord.
Whatever the case, as a part of this union, Radagon's prior 3 children with Renala became demigod stepchildren, granted grace thanks to their new family tree. Renala was broken by this, and so was her country, Leonia. The Queen's set reads, when Renala, head of both the Academy of Raya Lucaria and the Carian royal family, lost her husband Radagon, her heart went along with him, and then those at the Academy realized that Renala was no champion after all. In the wake of Radagon's betrayal and Renala's poor judgment, Leonia struggled with civil war, with the Academy of Raya
Try to
Lucaria
get these
on one
things.
side
Probably won't really
and
need
the
them much,
Carian
but
royals on the other. And it's
It's better
here,
to have them
during
than
the
not
age of the Erd
have
Tree,
them.
that Lunar Princess Rani, daughter of Renala and Radagon, stole a fragment of the Rune of Death.
It happened during the golden age of the Erd Tree, long before the shattering of the Elden Ring. Someone stole a fragment of the Rune of Death from Malekith, the Black Blade.
As mentioned previously, Malekith was Marika's shadow, and he had sealed destined death in a black blade.
Let's get more of
Then
this shit.
only a fragment of this Rune of Death was stolen. And once this happened, Malekith went a step further in protecting destined death.
I can't see the other
bound
side of the
blade
mask, so I'm just
within his own
assuming that it's
flesh,
identical.
such that none might rob death ever
I'm not
again.
about to boot up the
It was
game
too
and
late, however. This fragment of the Rune of Death
I
was
guess I
used
could,
immediately
actually.
that night to kill a demigod, Marika's own son, Godwyn the Golden.
That was the first recorded death of a demigod in all history, and it became the catalyst. Soon, the Elden Ring was smashed, and thus sprang forth the war known as the Shattering.
Now, there is a lot of really
Yeah.
credible evidence that Marika
Yeah, definitely
was
don't need to.
behind this plot to have a fragment of the Rune of Death stolen. There's also a
Alright.
ton of evidence that Marika is behind the entirety of your Tarnished quest, but we'll talk about that in another video. For now, all you really need to know, in terms of the timeline at least, is this. After the marriage of Marika and Radagon, and after a fragment of the Rune of Death was stolen, Marika went on to shatter the Elden Ring, and Radagon attempted to repair it, to no avail.
Alright,
The
gonna
Elden Ring
make
had been
the
broken into
eyebrows
runes, some great
and then
some
schnoz.
You know, it's said that Lord Radagon harbored a secret. A famed sculptor of the Erd Tree capital was once summoned to render Lord Radagon's likeness in giant stature, when he glimpsed the skeleton in Radagon's closet. And as such, it's said the great statue harbors his secret too.
Of course, the huge twist in Elden Ring is that
Zoom.
Radagon is Marika, or depending on what you
Alright,
believe,
we're good.
he became her, for she knew it was going to happen.
In Marika's own words, O Radigan, leal hound of the Golden Order, thou art yet to become me. Thou art yet to become a god. Let us be shattered, both. Mine other self.
You can tell when From Software is keeping something a little bit open-ended, and of everything in Elden Ring's lore, this will also go on to be one of the biggest unknowns as we move forward. For example, the wording, thou art yet to become me, reinforces that Marika and Radagon were two separate entities before the Shattering. However, in contrast, there is also evidence that Radagon was always part of Marika. For example, Enya says that
The demigods are each and all the direct
Indeed.
offspring of Queen Marika.
but how can this be if Radagon married Renala and had those demigod children? The only way that makes sense is if Radagon was always Marika and he just went over there to seduce Renala long ago. I'll present more concrete theories in the future, but on this matter, the most important thing is, what do you think? While you can figure out a ton of Elden Ring's story, not all of it is open to interpretation.
I think,
certain things are, and this
Souls
is one
games
of them.
have always had
Your
an
interpretation is a
interesting
big part of what makes this story special.
take on
At any rate,
duality.
the union of Radagon and Marika seems to be a union
Like
of
the Baphomet.
two fundamental opposing laws of the Golden Order.
Alright, let's whip
We
this
mentioned
board
these
down.
laws earlier, actually. There's the law of causality, and Marika is an agent of cause and effect. And there's the law of regression, as Radagon is a character who aspires to be complete and regress together. So I have a theory that forcing these two beings that represent these concepts together would have corrected Marika's deviance. But even so, she was imprisoned in the Erd Tree for the crime of the Shattering.
Marika's trespass demanded a heavy sentence. But even in shackles,
Still fusing
she
these
remains
chunks
a
together,
god
essentially.
And a vision's vessel.
The conjoined Radagon and Marika even had two demigod children of their own, Mikola and Millennia. These two children
I'm sure
were
there's
born
like a
afflicted.
much better way to do
Mikola
this,
was
but
cursed with eternal childhood.
we're just fucking
and
YOLO in it.
Millennia harbored a horrific rot within. Even so, these two children were both chosen as Empyreans, They were immensely sacred beings and eligible to inherit godhood from the Greater Will. Perhaps the Greater Will was just desperate to find a worthy successor, and indeed in the Shattering War to come, many would try to claim the shards of the Elden Ring, and they would try to take the throne, including, of course, the Tarnished, who returned from their long march at long last, which we'll talk about in the next main lore video. I should probably also mention here that if you become a patron, you'll see upcoming lore videos early, as that's one of the rewards you get if you pledge to the $3 tier. And if you think my channel really adds a lot of value to the Souls games for you to the point where you pledge $20, then in this new tier you'll receive a new mug every 3 months that has a unique design on it.
What, a new mug?
The games by From Software. There are 4 to
like
collect.
mugs.
The first one you'll get is inspired by Dark Souls, then Elden Ring, then Sekiro, and finally Bloodborne. And they all have fantastic art that I worked on with an amazing artist named Chu. But anyway, I figured this is the right place to end this video because the information here is going to be overwhelming. I bet it probably was too overwhelming, you know? It took me ages to commit these names and the relationships they had with other characters to memory, so I hope you guys are doing alright. One thing that helped me a lot was that we designed an enormous mind map with pretty much all
Jesus
of Elden Ring's
Christ.
lore, all of its
The
item
mother of all
descriptions,
fucking
its
flowcharts.
dialogues, all of the relationships between characters that we can
What the
think
fuck?
of. We added all of this together, and it helped a ton in learning about the story and
They
visualizing.
need to make that
it.
into a video.
One day, I will
I'll
make
watch that
this
shit.
asset available to you all because I think after
Alright,
doing it, I
let's
think
see.
this is the quintessential way
Needs more-
to piece together the story. And
more
I think
eyebrow
giving you
ridge.
guys this asset eventually
Because
will
it
make that
descends a lot
accessible
in the
for
top of the
people. So I'm
forehead,
really excited about that.
where it
I want
hides
to
underneath the cap.
thank Absa and Zard for accepting the paid
But
task
it
of
does look like
helping me put
he's
all the
bald,
raw
you know,
data
like
into this mind map so that I could better
he's
understand
got like a
everything.
5 head.
I want to thank
Maybe like a
Paragod for fulfilling
Socrates.
all of my footage requests and creating so many
Socrates,
cinematic
you know?
scenes for this video
Bald
and
crown.
for you all to enjoy. And I last of
I
all
mean, it's
want
been
to thank
replaced by
John Devlin
crystals
for the
anyway.
incredible thumbnail. And of course, thank you for watching. There are some
I might
really
make that out of
exciting things
paper.
ahead, and I actually believe this might be the best story that From Software have ever put together. I just
Who knows? We'll
think
see.
not only are there so many amazing item descriptions, but
We will
so many
see.
of them are impactful. There are so many moments where you piece together the story and have like a eureka moment,
Okay.
and I'm enjoying it so much.
So let's mash
Now I'm
on
gonna go
more
and play the game
forehead
a little bit
ridge.
because I've been editing this video for too long. So, see you next time. The demigods are each and all the direct offspring
Yeah,
of
this is the
Queen
video I want to
Marika.
watch.
There was Godwyn, Morgoth, Mohg, Radahn, Rykard, Rani, Mikola, and Melania, Blade of Mikola. Melania, Blade of Mikola. Melania, Blade of Mikola. And Melania. Not again. All of these demigods
She's never
had
known
fallen
defeat.
from grace by the time the shattering occurred. But in this video, I want to mostly talk about the origins of these characters, who these demigods were before the fall. And some of these demigods fell a long way indeed. Before he became this unsightly mess, Godwyn the Golden was quite the heroic figure. He was born of the promising union between Lord Godfrey and Queen Marika, and he achieved great renown for his bravery in one of their wars at least, the War of the Ancient Dragons. This war began when Grandsax, a great ancient dragon, rained calamity down upon Leyndell, marking the only time in historical record that Leyndell's walls had fallen. It's not clear why Grandsax first attacked, but fortifying themselves against lightning, the Knights of the Erdtree weathered his assault and Grandsax was defeated. However, this was only the beginning, and a bitter war against the ancient dragons was to follow. During this war, the Erdtree Sentinels had an epiphany that the only way to truly protect the Erdtree was to become dragons themselves. And
yeah, that
so,
makes sense.
spoiling the corpses of their foes, the grotesque sentinels served the Erdtree, but fought with the claws of the enemy instead. In the end, the ancient dragons were routed once again. In a graveyard of swords by the Stormcaller Church, the end of the war is commemorated. Here, we learn that during battle, Godwyn the Golden defeated Fortisax, called the mightiest dragon of them all. However, he did not kill
So for a nose, we
Fortisax.
make like a wedge
Instead,
chunk.
he befriended him.
But
And
we've
it was
already
in
got a
this
little bit of
act
one,
that
so
the powers
we
of
don't
the
need a
ancient
huge
dragons
wide chunk.
truly became a part of Leyndell. After all, only those loved by dragons can survive the ordeal of cladding their bodies in lightning. So, from an unlikely friendship, an ancient dragon
See how it
cult
looks
was
like,
born in the capital city, and the Knights of Leyndell learned to
one of
worship
those
the
Moai
dragons and
statue
wield their
heads.
lightning. Lanciax, sister of Fortisax, even took human form to better commune with the knights. It was officially decided that the worship of the ancient dragons did not conflict
that off me.
with belief in the Erd Tree, and it was all thanks to Godwyn, commander of the dragon's golden lightning, and a true child.
I might want to do
But now, let's
this
talk
kind
about
of thing
Morgoth
to keep
and
these
Mohg,
sides wet,
the Omen
you know,
twins,
or
who
moist.
were also born of Godfrey and Marika's
Damp.
golden lineage. First, what is an omen? Well, to put it simply, an omen
starting to
is
warm up.
an accursed child seen as
I don't like
impure, as they are born with horns on
Gonna
the
be
body.
summer
and
before
face.
we fucking
When
know
this
it.
happens, the correct thing to do, culturally at least, is to cut off the horns of the omen, an act which usually causes them to perish. It's pretty messed up, but some omen do survive this process, and
Yeah.
some omen are even given a cleaver, crafted specifically for them and awarded as a tool of war, although these weapons are bestowed with a readiness to take them away. We find one such omen in an Erd Tree camp upon the Altus Plateau. Before you fight it, you might have noticed another omen nearby, writhing in its sleep. It's said that
Ew.
omens see evil spirits in their nightmares, and I think this omen is dreaming, haunted by the vengeful spirits of its accursed kin. This brings us to the Omen Killers, who are horrifying butchers of twisted conscience. They wear these horned masks that make a mockery of the Omen's nightmares, and these butchers hunt the Omen and amputate their horns. The first Omen Killer was named Rollo, a famous perfumer who had to imbibe a physic
perfumers.
to rid himself of emotion so that he could better perform his tasks. Remember, it seems many omen have their horns excised when they're very young. That's definitely disturbing enough to warrant an emotion-killing physic.
Ew, they look
in
like
my
little
book.
hearts.
However, if the omen is born of royalty, then their horns are not cut off, but the omen is kept underground,
Oh, that makes
unbeknownst to
sense.
anyone, and imprisoned
Why,
for eternity. By way of
Morgoth
example,
looks like
you
that?
would have seen all kinds of omen confined to the sewers beneath Leyndell. But why are omen considered to be accursed in the first place?
Because look at
Some
them,
of them
bro.
are clearly intelligent, so what's inherently wrong with being
They're
born
ugly.
with horns and great strength? Well, it's important to remember, I think, that this curse might only really exist in the context of the Golden Order. After all, those afflicted with omen horns are not able to return
Right.
to the Erd Tree for
We might
rebirth,
have gone
and
a
are
little
said to be
ahead of ourselves
born
here.
outside of its grace. But why does the Golden Order disavow the omen, then? Well, it's hard to say for sure, but my working theory is that it's to do with the Crucible.
We need a lot more
According
clay.
to this ancient
on the face here.
incantation, horns were once an aspect of the Erd Tree's primordial crucible, where all life was once blended together. And with the exception of a couple of Crucible Knights in and around Leyndell, we know that the Golden Order has started to
We should
distance
just do
itself
this
from
the way
most
we know
things
how,
that touch upon the
one
Crucible.
piece at a time.
While things like horns, knots, feathers, and scales once grew on the human body and were considered signifiers of the divine, now they are disdained as impurities as civilization has advanced. We learn this from the knot, scale, and feather talismans, all of which are guarded by omen, or dropped by omen killers, no less. Unfortunately for the Order of the Erd Tree, these once divine impurities seem to crop up in some births, whether they like it or not. Almost like it's a genetic trait, as if it touches upon the crucible at the root of the Erd Tree. And so you have to ask, is it really a curse to be born as a graceless omen? Well, as with
Yeah.
most curses in
Yes,
these
it is.
games, I think that depends on your perspective. In any case, Mohg and Morgoth were omen royalty, and thus they were born into a wretched mire far below the earth, horns and all.
Okay, so that's like
Here,
the upper
they were
lip
kept under
and
the
the
strictest
cheeky
confinement.
poofs area.
Each of them were bound with charmed shackles
And
that
then
were
we will do a
covered in
rough
roots or thorns
lower lip
and bathed in golden magic. It seems very few people were
area.
supposed to know that they even existed.
Bam.
Morgoth,
That's
for his
the whole
part,
lower
renounced
cheek.
and despised his
We just need to
accursed
know
own
where.
blood.
See, this is
But
like
his brother
how big
Mohg
his face
embraced
is, and then the rest of it's just
Deep
freaking
underground,
hair.
Mohg stood before an outer god, a being
Yeah.
called the Formless Mother, who craves wounds, a being capable of bestowing power upon accursed blood. In this moment, Mohg's accursed blood erupted with fire, and he became besotted with the defilement that he was born into. Here, deep below the earth, he would go on to build a dynasty of blood in reverence of a mother, something it seems he never truly had. As for Morgoth, he was born into the same accursed fate as his twin brother, but despite not being blessed with grace, he loved the Erd Tree all the same, and even took it upon himself to crawl out of the sewers and become the Erd Tree's protector when the Erd Tree needed him most. In the end, he rightfully became the Omen King and Lord of Leyndell. Omen or not, he was, after all, born of Godfrey and Marika's golden lineage. Of course, the marriage between Godfrey and Marika would be ended, and before long, Marika remarried with another man, a champion named Radagon, who Marika calls her other half. He became second Elden Lord and the king consort, but he also brought with him 3 children from a previous marriage that he had had with
It's
a
like the
Carian
Brady
queen
Bunch.
named Renala. These children were Rani, Rykard, and Radahn, and they all became demigod stepchildren after Radagon's reunion with Queen Marika. Possessed of his father's flaming red hair, Radahn was fond of its heroic implications and considered himself to be born of a great champion. Yet he also looked up to another man, Godfrey, the first Elden Lord, Queen Marika's first husband and the Lord of the Battlefield. But Radahn wasn't just the son of Radagon and an aspiring Lord of the Battlefield, he was also the son of Renala, who was head of the Academy of Raya Lucaria and Queen of Caria. So as a Carian royal, inclined towards sorcery, Radahn bent his will towards mastering gravitational magics. Rock sling, gravity well, collapsing stars. These techniques were taught to him in Celia, the town of sorcery, all so he would never have to abandon his beloved but scrawny steed. That said, before long, his powers would be put towards a more cosmic purpose than simply allowing him to ride his own horse. Radahn was taught gravitational magic by an Alabaster Lord, a member of a race of ancients with skin of stone.
Really? The Alabaster Lord? That's the guy we fight down by the beach?
And when his lessons were complete,
So it's the same
Radahn
one?
uttered these chilling words.
Thank you for your tutelage. For now, I can challenge the stars.
And, of course, he did conquer the stars, and the very constellations would be halted by his strength. But of course, you kind of have to ask, why? Why was it necessary to conquer the stars in the first place? Well, I have a couple of theories. Theory 1 is that it was done in self-defense. After all, according to the Sword Gravestone, Radahn was protecting Celia. What's more, gravitational magic has destructive power, and many gravitational beasts are proof of that destructive power. A being named Astel had even come down to the lands between in the past
the malformed
and
star.
destroyed a place called the Eternal City. What's more, Celians are descendants of the Eternal, positioned right above the Eternal City underground, so there is an argument to be made for Radahn purely defending Celia for some reason here. But it's possible for Radahn to have fought in this conflict and to have made the first move as well. So this is theory 2.
Maybe he had a
Radahn
crush on her.
conquered the stars as a preventative measure in service to the greater
Oh, I'm
will.
thinking of Selen.
According to a set of astrologer items, the night sky cradles fate. There's even a banished sect of people called the Nox, who live deep below the earth in eternal anticipation of the coming age of stars and their Lord of Night.
Part here.
Long ago, these people invoked the eye.
Makes their
of the
forehead
greater
look
will.
strange.
So it would make
wide.
sense that those in service to the greater will might have sought to arrest the stars and put an end to this fate. What's more, Radahn was just a huge fanboy of Godfrey, and he seems to have more loyalty to the Erd Tree than to the moon. Finally, the telescope item description says that the fate once writ in the night skies had been fettered by the Golden Order, so surely this is referencing Radahn's actions, and it levels the blame at the Golden Order. But putting Radahn's motivations aside, it's a fact that the stars were held back, and that this had great consequences for many, especially for the rest of his Carian royal family.
Indeed, and when we kick his ass, the stars start moving again.
The Carian royal family is guided by the stars, as is the fate of Lady Rani, first heir in the Carian royal line. But General Radan is the conqueror of the stars, who stood up to the swirling constellations, halting their movement in a smashing victory. And so, if General Radan were defeated, the stars would once again resume their movement.
See, the guy just literally told you what you need to do, and people are like, this game doesn't tell you what to do. I don't know what to do in this game. That fool just literally told you what to do.
Interestingly, if you look at her true body atop the Divine Tower, it looks like she might have also inherited the red hair of Radagon. Cool detail. But unlike her brother, Radan, she quite clearly took after her mother more, who was Renala, head of the Carian royal family. The House of Caria has this storied history, one that seems to go way back to the astrologers. In the Carian Manor, we find one of their treasures, the Sword of Night and Flame. It reads, astrologers who preceded the sorcerers established themselves in mountaintops that nearly touched the sky and considered the fire giants their neighbors. Renala herself was an astrologer, always chasing the stars in her youth. Then she met the full moon, and in time, the astrologer became a queen, establishing the House of Caria as royalty. Caria appears to have a matriarchal hierarchy, with multiple princesses and Carian knights that serve as their retainers. Now, however, there is only one princess, Rani, daughter of Renala. And at the time of her birth, she would have been set to inherit quite a lot of power indeed, for the Carian royal family was at its height, and her mother was not only queen, she was also head of the Academy of Raya Lucaria, having bewitched them with the enchanting power of the full moon. Leading the young Rani by the hand, Renala guided her daughter to a meeting with a moon of her own. What Rani beheld was cold, dark, and veiled in occult mystery. A dark moon, a sort of twin to Renala's own full moon. You can even see both of these hanging in the sky if you stargaze from the heights of the Moonlight Plateau. Another who guided Rani was a character called the Snowy Crone, who the young Rani encountered deep in the woods. When you look at Rani, it's actually the likeness of this snow witch that
you can see. Alright, so I need to build the cheek and then come back over the top, because you can see the eyelid here overlaps.
Clearly Rani looked up to this mysterious woman. She became Rani's secret mentor, and she even knew about the dark moon, teaching the young Rani to fear it as she imparted her cold sorceries. So, what do these moons represent? That's just a theory, but I think the moons kind of act as guides. The lost black moon of Noxtella, for example, was the guide of countless stars.
Amari.
What's more, Rani and Renala were heavily influenced by the moons. Renala's moon bewitched the academy that she became the head of, and Rani's dark moon, for its part, also imparts wisdom and leads a voyage in the Age of Stars ending. They could even be outer gods. And yet, for all of this guidance, Caria and Leonia as a whole have experienced steep decline. Radagon betrayed the House of the Moon.
Let's get the cheeks going,
the stars out of motion.
So we can start on the eyebrows,
flooded to the north.
or the lack of eyebrows, rather.
In the west, and the stars and moon have gone their separate ways. Nevertheless, Rani, last princess of Caria, remains, carefully setting new plans into motion. Sibling to Rani and Radan was a man named Rykard, who was lord of the Volcano Manor.
Like this.
There is evidence that Rykard was friendly with his siblings. He conspired with his sister Rani later on.
What are these?
There's even a portrait of Radan.
We'll put a little blob here, because we want, so this stuff falls away from the nose, you know?
Item descriptions mark Rykard as stern, ambitious, heroic,
so we just gotta
and
work
blasphemous. A part of this blasphemy was opposing the Erd Tree, which actually drew many knights to his banner, for Rykard believed in taking by force, just as the gods did, and clearly many believed that he would usher in a new age. The armor set of the Gelmir Knights reveals to us what were once very loyal soldiers.
There we go.
The crest of red feathers are there to symbolize Rykard's pedigree as Lord Radagon's son. and the emblem upon their chest piece represents a lord who had lofty ambitions. However, as Rykard delved into the ancient secrets of Mount Gelmir, he came across the immortal Great Serpent, an ancient deity that aligned with Rykard's ambitions. And so, Rykard fed himself to the Great Serpent so that he might devour, grow, and live eternally. Alas,
yeah, and then
this
like
was
his
too much
will
for his
took it
knights.
over or some
They
shit.
believed that their master's heroic ambitions had degenerated into mere greed. So they searched desperately for a weapon with which they might halt their lord. And they found it too. The immortal serpent had lived for a long time, and so there was also a weapon.
We got a
to
rough
kill
little
it
beard
that had been
going.
designed long ago as well, a serpent hunter. But it was too late.
Right.
As the lord lost his dignity,
This is
so
way
too
too dry.
did the knights lose their master. Not that it bothered Rykard.
Now we can devour God together.
Next, we need to discuss Melania and Mikola. These two were twins as they were born. No, Rykard, please. Anyway, as you know, Radagon's marriage with Renala did not last. Afterwards, he returned to the Golden Order and became Queen Marika's consort. But what I haven't yet mentioned is that together,
Oh, you got the
they
new
were blessed with
relic?
2 demigod children, the
Nice.
so-called twin prodigies.
I haven't even downloaded the
In the last
update
full
yet.
video, I briefly proposed that these 2 twins were born after the Shattering, after
Pitiful.
Radagon and Marika
Shameful.
had merged together to become a single god. However, I've since changed my mind. I think Melania and Mikola were clearly born before the Shattering. There's just so much proof that these 2 twins were a force that were influencing the world long before the Shattering took place. Anyway, both of these twins were born afflicted. Specifically, in the Japanese text, it's said that their births were vulnerable. Mikola was born afflicted with eternal youth, and Melania, for her part, was vulnerable to rot. Interestingly, Melania's scarlet rot is actually an outer god. This outer god, like many others in the game, seems to have an
I need to be
order
caught
that
up on
is
Manderville
able to be
quests for that
imposed
though,
on
right?
The world via an Empyrean vessel, and Melania
I think
was
I'm
that
like
vessel. And while the
several
scarlet
patches
rot is
behind.
pretty terrible, you can sort of argue that it's got a beauty to it. According to Gowry, the order of rot is resplendent. It's a cycle of death and rebirth. Kind of like the lotus flower, which is a flower that blooms anew, beautiful and fresh from mud. I actually have art of this flower hanging in my home. I always love the symbol of it. I actually have lots of art hanging now, and I'm going to talk about all of this artwork that you can buy at the end of the video. Anyway, so Melania the Empyrean was vulnerable to and afflicted by the scarlet rot. There was said to be no cure to this, and while fire and consecration seemed to be somewhat
New
effective
relic
at
tools
warding it
for
off,
crafting and gathering.
Melania would
Nice.
slowly lose her physical self to the rot. Interestingly, old legends of the Scarlet Rot have persisted in the world for generations, and we learn more about the Rot God from the Blue Dancer charm. The dancer
Okay,
in
we'll
blue
stick one
represents
right
a
here.
fairy, who, in legend, bestowed a flowing sword
We're gonna need one
on a
right
blind
here.
swordsman. Blade in hand, the swordsman sealed away an ancient god, a god that was rot itself. Specifically, this god was long ago sealed away in the stagnant water that is downstream of the Ainsel River underground. And wherever rot appears, the kindred of rot appear as well. These are pests and servants of the rot. And now, in the current age, these are servants that have been forsaken by Melania, who is their new goddess. So, this blind swordsman with the flowing curved sword actually went on to become Melania's mentor. So technically it's him that we have to blame for this goddamn attack. The prosthesis wearer heirloom tells us more. A talisman engraved with a scene from a heroic tale. Though born into the accursed rot, when the young girl encountered her mentor and his flowing blade, she gained wings of unparalleled strength. Melania's ridiculous attack is called the waterfowl dance, and aesthetically it makes sense that, flowing waters would counter the effects of rot. For just as still waters turn foul, stagnation turns to decay. Thus, warriors must remain ever drifting. And indeed, Melania does resist the call of the rot. There's a lot of evidence that she's not really a willing vessel, but through sheer will and sense of self, she resists the rot. And Only when she is truly pressed in
her
battle
story
will
doesn't
she
seem like she
abandon this will
really
and
enjoys the
bloom
rot
into
or
the goddess
embraces it.
within. Millennia's first bloom was during her fight against Radahn, and releasing her scarlet rot was a last-ditch effort that would forever taint the land of Caelid and cripple Radahn. So, whatever she was fighting for in this fight against Radahn, somehow it was worth this terrible act. In general terms, at least, it's clear that Millennia was fighting for her brother. Apart from the times where she relapses into being the goddess of rot, she is known as the Blade of Miquella. She actually goes to great lengths to tell you this. I don't know if you heard. Despite being the toughest boss in From Software history, she's actually fighting for his right to godhood, not her own. In Millennia's own words, her brother Miquella possesses the wisdom, the allure of a god. He is the most fearsome Empyrean of all. For his part, Miquella did a lot to earn his sister's dedication, not the least of which was inspiring her armor and a prosthetic of unalloyed gold. And it's not just his sister that loved Miquella, many people did. The Bewitching Branch is an item that you can use to turn enemies into temporary allies, and it reads, "Indeed, he has learned very well how to compel such affection." For his father Radagon, Miquella fashioned and gifted to him a fundamentalist incantation called Triple Rings of Light. Radagon then returns the favor, gifting back an incantation called Radagon's Rings of Light. These interactions show some of Miquella's positive connections with his father, and also Golden Order fundamentalism. And yet, the young Miquella abandoned fundamentalism, for it could do nothing to treat Millennia's accursed rot. This was the beginning of unalloyed gold. So, what is unalloyed gold? Well, an alloy is a composition of metals, so unalloyed gold is pure gold, essentially, with no external mixtures. This gold apparently can ward away the meddling of outer gods, and so Miquella bent a lot of his efforts towards creating an unalloyed gold needle. Specifically, this needle was crafted for his sister, to ward off the rot god and forestall the effects of the incurable rotting sickness. We see the bond between the siblings as well when we visit Miquella's Halig tree. We see a statue of a one-armed woman embracing a child, Miquella. In this place, we see the biggest example of Miquella's benevolence, the Halig tree, and the society that was built into the brace that supports it. This was a promised land, seen as a salvation to many who were shunned or persecuted, provided that they can actually find the path here, of course. And like many other Empyreans, Miquella seems to have had the will within them to create a new order, and his is an order that's somewhat modeled on the ones that came before it. The biggest thing is that the Halig tree is clearly inspired by the Erd tree. But the difference is that Miquella's Halig tree is said to be accepting of all, even those the Erd tree shuns. Miquella himself was once embedded inside of the Halig tree, and he watered it with his very own blood since it was a mere sapling. Tragically, however, he was ripped out of this womb during the shattering, and his Halig tree ultimately failed to grow into an Erd tree, becoming a misshapen husk instead. But
it makes sense. You fed it blood, bro.
There's also a ton of cut
trees grow on water
to do with Miquella, and he's one of the most mysterious demigods, who I'm sure we'll learn about more later. But there is one more thing that I want to mention before I go. It's kind of one theory I had during the making of this video. So, Miquella and Millennia each have their own butterflies. Millennia's is the Aeonian butterfly, which inhabit the swamp of Aeonia and are rumored to come from the wings of the rot goddess herself. And I think it's fair to say that Miquella's butterfly is the
probably true. When you get to phase 2, she puts her wings out and it's all those fucker butterflies
for its entire life. This is a reference to Miquella's eternal youth and his cocoon in the Halig tree. But there is, of course, a third butterfly, right? There's the smoldering butterfly. It's said to be an eternally burning butterfly that serves as kindling. Now bear with me, but it's my theory that this butterfly is a reference to Melina, who the Blade of Calling calls the kindling maiden and the one who walks alongside flame. This might suggest that Melina is a sibling to Melania and
She's a
Nicola.
ginger.
Again, that's just a theory, but what I really want to talk about here
Or at
is
least
that
ginger
at the
enough.
very least, Melina is
Half ginger.
almost certainly the daughter of Marika. We learned this a long time ago from looking at her name in the game's files, and we can further infer it from her dialogue, as she has a few lines that refer to mothers and one that says that she was born inside the Erd Tree. So her being the daughter of Marika is also just a theory, but this one is much more concrete than the butterfly one. Although the reason I like the butterfly theory is that it gives us a hint as to who Melina's parents might have been. Her parents would have been Radigan and Marika, which is to say Marika herself alone, I guess, because Radigan is Marika.
They're the same
Honestly,
freaking being.
Melina as a character has only become more mysterious since the game was released, and I'm really only scratching the surface with this theory. But speaking of times before Elden Ring was released, back then, a long time ago, I commissioned this piece from a renowned artist named Marco, and now I'm so excited to reveal it for the first time. This storybook scene is heavily inspired by the early looks we had at Elden Ring, with a red-haired protagonist, spirit companions, a mount that looks like Yakul and a bit like Torrent, and a few other hidden details in the piece. This piece and all of my other prints are now available over at Spring, where you can actually buy them fully framed and ready to hang. They actually ship with a beautiful frame. The frame itself is a nice black satin finish, and you can even opt for a white border around the print, which I think looks really classy in certain cases. I think these posters
I feel like we should probably get the nose looking right as a reference for the rest of the damn face.
In return, that will make your room look better. So check out my prints if you're interested. But this is the end, and thank you for watching. I'll see you next time. Where do you go after death? What is the right way to die? Can death be overcome? And if it can, what are the consequences of such a thing? These questions are at the very heart of Elden Ring's story, and in order to answer them, I want to go over a set of bosses that are defined by the relationship
very
to
unique
death.
schnoz.
Those being the Deathbirds, the Ancestral Spirits, the Tibia Mariners, the Godskins, the Burial Watchdogs, and the Black Knife Assassins. Understanding these bosses will teach you so much. In Elden Ring, oneself is separated into two distinct entities. There's the body, which is one's physical self or corporeal flesh, and then there's the spirit, which is essentially the soul that commonly persists after death. In the age of the Erd Tree, the bodies of the dead and their spirits are returned to the Erd Tree. This is done via a process called Erd Tree Burial, where great tree roots in catacomb dungeons absorb the dead, so that they might be immortalized with the Erd Tree. But it was not always this way. In fact, the entire culture of death had a different shape in the earlier days of the Lands Between. Back then, instead of Erd Tree burial, death commonly burned in Ghost Flame. Ghost Flame, also known as Spirit Flame, is a cold, white flame that is created when bones are burned to ash. We learn this from the fallen hawks who prowl the underground rivers. When the last embers of their torches were used up, they were forced to burn the bones of their fellows instead, and acquired the cold ghost flame. This process appears to help separate the spirit from the body, and while a lot of these spirits appear to be vengeful based on the ghost flame spells, I think in general having the body separated from the spirit in this way would have been a desired outcome. I speculate that we see proof of this even in the current age, where the wandering dead at Agheel Lake gaze at the sky, praying that the dragon Agheel might burn them to ash. Perhaps this was simply the acceptable way.
It's because they're a bunch of fucking weirdos, man.
To rest.
Dragon Daddy burned me.
The keepers of Ghost Flame were the Deathbirds, who tended to the flame in their graveyards, raking out the ashen remains of the dead from their kilns.
Those boys
So
ain't
I like
right.
to think of the Deathbirds as serving the old process of death and delivering death by reducing bodies to ash so that spirits might be better able to move on. Now, admittedly, a lot of these spirits are vengeful, and that's how Ghost Flame is sort of weaponized by the Deathbirds and sorcerers. But I do think that at its core, Ghost Flame was important just because it separated the body
Give him
and
a
the spirit.
good little
After all, the explosive
stabby
Ghost Flame
carvy.
sorcery
Boom.
compares this process of death to the Erd Tree's process of death, which was pretty all-encompassing. So I think it's safe to assume that Ghost Flame was just really important to the process
big
of
old
death,
nostrils.
and it was more than just, vengeful spirits and a weapon to be used. And next we should talk about the Twin Bird, which was the mother of the Death Birds. We don't find this creature in-game, but we can find its likeness painted vividly upon a kite shield that one of the Death Birds drops. The design might remind you of a phoenix, which is traditionally drawn with bright colors and a crest of feathers and a longish neck. Of course, the phoenix is a creature that rises from the ash when it dies, which is obviously extremely fitting for this story. So the kite shield tells us that the twin bird, or this phoenix creature, is said to be the mother of the death birds. But not only that, it's also called the envoy of an outer god. So we can kind of compare the twin bird to the two fingers, then, who are also envoys to an outer god. They are envoys to the greater will, and similarly, I assume the twin bird probably communes with some outer god.
And you can see
and while we're definitely
carving
left
the hole
wondering
from
what
within
greater
gives like
purpose
a
this
natural
outer
shape
god might have,
to the outside of the
mere fact
nostril.
that it exists lends a lot of significance to the twin bird and its death birds as well. A variation on the death bird is the death right bird, which is an alternate boss, and it's a far more threatening foe, as it actually seems to use power that it's gained from certain spirits and ghost flame. And if you look really closely at its ethereal wings, you might even spy little spirits lurking within. And when I saw these, I was really excited because I recognized the weapon they're using, and the weapon explains who they are. They're holding a little death ritual spear, and that item reads, "The priests became the guardians of the birds through the rite of death, which is a part of their contract for a far-off resurrection." So deathbirds have a lot to do with sacrificial rites. They don't just attend to the ghost flame, they also deliver death, and they also perform rites of death. So we can assume that these priests were sacrificed
We need to
in
get
a rite
it
of death
at the
so
right
that they
angle,
could lend a sort of spiritual
so we can carve it into
strength
the
to the
face.
deathbirds. But we're still left wondering about the nature of their contract with the
I
deathbirds.
think I have the
which
nose a little too
promises
big,
far-off resurrection,
a little too long.
What agreement did these priests come to with the deathbirds?
But that's
I wonder what
fine,
has to
because I just
happen
go
for
like
their
this,
contract to be fulfilled, and
fold it in,
how will they even be resurrected?
spread it
In
out.
terms of where the deathbirds appear, they kind of appear everywhere, and I think that might be a hint that their influence was once present far and wide. And while their importance in the current age is likely quite
and then
diminished,
the excess
they still
goes into the
definitely
cheeks.
are relevant in the lands between. In fact, many other enemies actually make reference to them, and some even successfully channel their powers. Even Ghost Flame lights the way in Catacomb
this.
to this day. But in general, there is a lot of power that can be gained from death in the lands between, which brings us to the ancestral spirit. In the flourishing landscapes underneath the lands between, you would have found the bodies of 3 large stags enshrined by the ancestral followers. These warriors, hunters, and shamans believe heavily in the principle that life sprouts from birth, but also from death. I think this principle is sort of represented by horns, because in real life, horns continue to grow throughout the lifespans of animals, with their primary function usually being to convey a social hierarchy. And here, the largest and most influential creature is a giant stag. And in the world of Elden Ring, since life continues after death, it makes sense then that this creature's antlers continue to bud and grow even after its death. We learn this from defeating the regal ancestor spirit and looking at the horn of this fallen king. New growths bud, glowing with light. Thus does new life grow from death, and from death one.
It was like the easiest boss in the whole freaking game.
Like this are
big and dramatic
followers,
and
a race
easy
of beings
AF.
who keep their distance from the Erd Tree and are just content to await new buds and new growth. If a being does not show signs of budding horns or new growth, then they are sacrificed with an axe called the Winged Greathorn. Interestingly, the twin blades of this sacrificial axe are called Envoy's Wings, which might be a reference to the twin bird we mentioned earlier, which was also a winged envoy. According to the Horn Charm talismans, the ancestral spirits specifically arise from long-lived beasts, and I think this touches on another commonly repeated theme in Elden Ring, which is that there are benefits to living life to its fullest potential. To quote some more Deathbird items, the most glorious end awaits those who cling tenaciously to life, and it is important to render up a death worth offering. Those who lived a heroic life were even able to go on and see a unique version of grace in the afterlife. We currently think that this grace is red, and that these are the same red rays of grace that you might have noticed when you first explored the Forbidden Lands. So this might be the most intriguing part of the video.
Interesting.
Let me explain. Past the Forbidden Lands and deep within the consecrated snowfields is a Tibia Mariner, and this one drops Helfen's Steeple, a great sword that reveals just a mind-blowing amount of lore for one item. First, it reads, "Greatsword patterned after the black steeple of the Helfen, the lampwood which guides the dead of the spirit world." So the word steeple is commonly used to describe the tall spire found on churches, and indeed, the design of Helfen's steeple echoes that of the Morion blade from Dark Souls, which also referenced the spire of a church. However, while I think Helfen is likely to be a sort of church, I don't think it's a building. Instead, this item seems to be describing the shape of a black tree in the spirit world, a so-called lampwood or lamplight tree that serves as a guidepost for the heroic dead. The item goes on to say that lamplight is similar to grace in appearance, and it is said that it can only be seen by heroic spirits or those who met their death in battle. So the black tree of Helfen is almost like this dark mirror of the Erd tree, but in the spirit world. It's so interesting that it even gives off its own guidance of grace, and there's a few reasons we speculate that this grace might be red. First, a red gem can be found at the very tip of Helfen's steeple, and a gem on the rolled medallion as well. Plus, there's a red glow visible from the sword's gem, and a red glow from the rolled medallion when you hold it up at the Grand Lift, where it takes you to the Forbidden Lands, where we speculate that you can briefly glimpse this lamplight, or red grace, filtering between the trees. So you might be asking, why can we see the grace when we're not
because
dead?
Because we're special,
but
obviously.
Tarnished
Elden
are
Lord,
defined
bro.
as the dead who yet live, so it might make some sense that we can see it. The next question is, where does the lamplight lead? And I think there's two options. One is that the lamplight might lead back to Helfen itself. That is the source of the light after all, and Helfen's steeple can be enwreathed in ghost flames, so maybe the dead are sort of put to rest here. Alternatively though, I guess it's also possible that the lamplight has plans for the heroic dead, just like Grace has plans for the tarnished. It might
probably
lead them
not.
somewhere else as well.
It's a fucking tree, bro.
In my discussions with Quelaag, who helped
Well,
with
I don't
these
know,
theories,
maybe
she pointed out the similarities
maybe trees
that
are more
Helfen
special
has
than we
with
know.
Valhalla.
Some
of
hippie
Nordic
bullshit
folklore.
is what it is.
If you don't know, Valhalla
Tree
is
huggers.
a place where brave spirits would be invited to dine with the gods. And it seems that Helfen is inspired by that same sort of folklore, since only heroic spirits can see the light. Not to mention, Hel, with one L, is actually the name of the world of the dead in Nordic folklore. And speaking of folklore, this finally brings us back to the Tibia Mariner, the boss that dropped Helfen's steeple in the first place. The Tibia Mariners themselves actually have no written lore to speak of, which is kind of a shame. But what they do have is an incredible visual design, and it kind of carries them from a lore perspective, because this visual design is steeped very heavily in appropriate folklore. So, in Greek mythology, there is a stretch of water called the River Styx, which marks the boundary between Earth and the underworld. And to help souls of the deceased cross this river, you have to find the river boatman and pay him to safely take you across. Just so I kind of imagine the dead in Elden Ring are being drawn to the Tibia Mariner in a similar fashion.
What are these coins you would have to feed the ferryman?
And he might offer
Certainly not Obol.
to the underworld. There is one spell that references this boss briefly. It's Tibia's Summons, and it says, "For time immemorial, the dead have been those who are lost."
Yeah, let's do that now.
Let's suffice to say,
do a little
death was a very
carvy
important facet of life in the lands between, even for the gods at one point. Which brings us to the Godskins, an order of apostles that were born to deliver destined deaths to the gods long ago. I kind of like to think of them as a counterbalancing force to the influence of gods. wielding sharp tools for boring.
And then we can take this
slicing through
extra
flesh,
shit.
and incanting spells that mocked the wrath of the gods. It seems these godskins actually
We can stick it
succeeded in
here.
hunting many gods, if their name is to be believed. Their robes were made by sewing together patches of smooth skin, and the nobles' robes include subcutaneous fat, which makes them plump and soft. Known for their seven,
and then we
faced
get that
aprons,
overlapping
these nobles
ridge.
are the most ancient apostles, and
Like
they're
this.
deeply inhuman. Their weapon is not a slicer, but a stitcher,
Bloop.
and they wield it with a skill that is unmatched by any lowborn. These beings were elevated to a social class above the lowborn because they served a queen, a glowmide queen. The black flames they wield are actually channeled from that queen's greatsword, and it was this queen who raised them from birth in the first place, cradling her newborn apostles in godskin cloth so that they might grow to become the death of the gods. This glowmide queen was powerful, but what makes her character so important is that she was also an
There,
Empyrean.
and now it's got that like
chosen by the
overlapping
fingers.
effect.
Now, remember, an Empyrean is a candidate chosen by the two fingers to become a god. So
We can actually
despite
just
being
make it
such a
overlap
dark character,
actually instead of giving it an
Glowmide Queen
effect.
was still a valid choice for godhood.
Okay.
And all of this, of course, was before the Rune of Death had been removed from the Elden Ring, and it was from this Rune of Death that the Black Flame originally got its power.
Okay.
We only know of one other Empyrean alive at this time, and that would have been Queen Marika. Naturally, at some point, Marika and the Glowmide Queen clashed. Though, according to the Godslayer Greatsword description, we know that the Glowmide Queen was defeated by Malekith, who was the shadow of Queen Marika. He is credited with defeating the Glowmide Queen and the Apostles, and sealing off the Rune of Death, which again was the source of their power. What's not clear to me about all of this, though, is whether Marika and the Glowmide Queen were rival Empyreans.
Oh, this is
competing for
bone dry
godhood,
already.
or if Marika was already a god and decided to take out
Be
the
right back.
Glowmide
I'm gonna
Queen
get more
because the
more
Glowmide
wawa.
Queen was an Empyrean threat to her age. But at any rate, it seems like Marika and the Glowmide Queen are opposites. You know,
Let us
the
cover
Glowmide
this.
Queen ends ages, but Marika wished for an age eternal. So it makes sense that they'd clash, but there's still so much we don't know about them. But after all of this, Marika's Age of the Erd Tree began, and during this age, you were supposed to wait for the roots of the Erd Tree to call to you, so that your spirit could return to the Erd Tree after death to be immortalized with it. Specifically, these roots were found in catacomb dungeons, and there's even a statue found across the lands between that was designed to help people find these catacomb dungeons. This is the statue of Rosus, the Usher of Death, and he shows the dead the path towards catacomb dungeons. The catacombs themselves were built in the Age of the Erd Tree. This is proven by root resin, which states that the roots here were once linked to the Erd Tree, and it was for this reason that catacombs were constructed around these great tree roots. So at this point in history, Queen Marika had implemented her new concept for death in the lands between, and in her eyes, a proper death meant returning to the Erd Tree. Thus, in the days where catacomb roots were connected to the Erd Tree, these catacombs were valid sites of Erd Tree burial, and I think we literally see this taking place, as corpses can be seen being absorbed by the roots at the end of every catacomb dungeon. The process of Erd Tree burial, though, is described as an honor reserved for heroes, and this process of Erd Tree burial is presided over by Erd Tree burial watchdogs, who protect the catacombs with their impish servants. These creatures are golems, and I think that they might have been created specifically during the period of history where Liurnia had an allegiance with Leyndell, since they serve the process of Erd Tree burial, but their weapons actually have glintstone embedded in them. Furthermore, when hit by impure crystal darts, they malfunction, which I think is further proof of their glintstone origins. In some catacombs and graveyards, the physical bodies of the dead have begun to rise. Now, these beings are defined as those who live in death, and they are a relatively recent phenomenon in the lands between. Instead of having their body and spirit return to the Erd Tree, they rise, in an act that is completely at odds with Marika's concept of death, Erd Tree burial, and the Golden Order. I'll go into more detail on this later when we talk about Godwin, but basically, this all began when Rani stole a fragment of the Rune of Death from Malakath, and then she imparted its power onto the knives of the Black Knife Assassins. You can tell the Assassins have quite a lot of secrets in their lore. We do know a few things, though. We know that they're all women, they're all Newman, and they have links to Queen Marika and the Eternal City as well. We'll have to go into more detail on them later, though. But with their knives imbued with the Rune of Death, they carved a curse mark into two demigods, Rani and Godwin. The curse mark itself is an obtainable item, and it reads, "This curse mark was carved at the moment of death of the first demigod, and should have taken the shape of a circle. However, two demigods perished at the same time, breaking the curse mark into two half-wheels. Rani was the first of the demigods whose flesh perished, while the Prince of Death perished in soul alone." So interestingly, these assassins and the knives imbued with the Rune of Death had the power to cleave life from the physical body and from the spirit as well. Specifically, Rani was the one whose flesh perished, and she became a disembodied spirit, free from her corporeal flesh, which is what she wanted, and she now occupies a doll. But Godwin became the Prince of Death, living without a soul and spreading the Rune of Death across the lands between through Deathroot. Now, according to item descriptions, Deathroot is the Rune of Death itself, and it acts as a source that gives rise to those who live in death. Now, what I find really interesting is the fact that this Rune of Death that is embodied by Deathroot and those who live in death, it clearly has aspects of both death and life as well, which makes sense based on what you should have learned from this episode, right? Because death isn't just the end, it's life as well. So it makes sense that those who live in death would have aspects of death and life, all contained in these beings that were brought to life, in a sense, by the Rune of Death. And while those who live in death are a bit unnatural because they do come from this fragmented Rune of Death, this half of a curse mark, they still have life in death, and so you can argue that they still have a right to life. And in fact, that's entirely what one of the endings is about, at least how I understand it, and I'll try to explore it more thoroughly later on. These beings are persecuted and hunted down by fundamentalists of the Golden Order, and whether these fundamentalists are truly serving the fundamentals of order in the first place is just a topic that is very interesting to explore. So, in conclusion, maybe it shouldn't be a sin to live in death. After all, to quote Fear, "In death there is only peace, for in death there can be no sensation." Thank you for watching. Special thanks to Quayla for looking over this script. She has an awesome channel that you really should go and check out. And it's been great to have someone to just discuss my ideas with. Many of Elden Ring's bosses serve Marika's Golden Order in some shape or form, whether they're loyal to it or enslaved by it. So let's discuss all of these bosses, starting at a time before Order had even come to the lands between. To the north are Mountaintops of the Giants, a name that makes it abundantly clear just who dominated this region of the world. However, it was not always this way. According to the Borealis' Mist incantation, the Ice Dragons were once lords of the mountaintops long ago, until they were defeated by the Fire Giants and chased
Icy dragons.
from the peak. And perched upon this peak stands an enormous
I'll be by the
forge.
Fire Dragons.
Interestingly, the chain
I
rings
changed my
of
shirt.
this
I didn't want to
forge
ruin the other one.
dragons,
I actually really
which might
like
be a
it.
reference to the dragons that once dwelt
Not
here.
that I don't like this one. It's
And
just this one's
I
old.
don't think we can say for sure
Already
who
messed up.
built this forge. The art of smithing is said to have originated among the giants, and the craft was even once considered divine. So it seems likely that at the very least, they made good use of this fire. Sparks from this forge would fall down and fertilize the smoldering flowers that bloomed upon the mountaintops, and it seems like it was a pretty crucial part
All right,
of
so we got
life in
one
this
old
region.
guy cheek.
The most ancient
Now let's make
giants
the other old guy
called
cheek.
fire giants, and according to the Burn
Might be
of
easier to
Flame
do it
incantation, they have
upside
long
down.
held a solitary curse
We'll find out.
to serve as keepers of the flame for eternity.
We will
Now,
find
traditionally,
out.
in From Software games, curses are the domain of the gods, and indeed, the fire giants are cited to have borrowed power from one such god, who is represented here by a single
Okay, so let's
large
do
red
this.
eye. This god is called a god
Stick
of the
that
flame,
here.
and it's believed to be able to inhabit fire itself, as well as the bodies of the fire giants who worshipped it.
And we'll
The
do
giants
this.
shared borders with the astrologers, who, according to their legendary Sword of Night and
Stick that
Flame,
here.
established themselves in the mountaintops and considered the fire giants their neighbors. The relationship here is implied to be friendly, even collaborative, maybe, as the sword does combine the power of both flame and the power of the primeval current that's glimpsed within the night sky. The sword would go on to become a treasure of the Carrion royal family, and the Carrions themselves are likely descendants of the astrologers. Generations later, these Carrion royals would call upon their old giant allies for aid, but we'll get to that in a moment. The fire giants also had another neighbor, with whom relations were not so amicable. Further down the mountains, just past the Forbidden Lands, roamed the Knights of Zamor. According to their armor, these long-lived warriors, clad in
Oh, they got
biting,
cool faces.
freezing winds, are said to have been the mortal enemies of the fire giants since time immemorial.
Maybe I'll make them next.
According to their weaponry, these beings were devoted to winter itself and had weapons styled after icy winds and bodies that were cloaked in swirling ice storms. It makes good sense that such cold beings would be natural mortal enemies of the fire giants, and they commonly did challenge their larger rivals. But it seems like their true chance came when Queen Marika waged war against the fire giants, and the Knights of Zamor gladly joined her offensive. They earned great renown amongst the Order of the Erd Tree, and many ancient heroes of Zamor became hailed as heroes, as the fire giants were largely wiped from the face of the earth after this war. Now,
Yikes.
up until now, I've resisted calling the giants evil, but the reality is that in pretty much every item description, their god is described as a fell god, and the giant's flame is a flame of ruin. And to be fair, their
He
god
wants to
doesn't
consume
seem
everything.
like a super nice guy. I mean, it only really opens its eye when the fire giant boss sacrifices a leg, which is pretty metal. But I'm sort of giving them the benefit of the doubt because I think it's pretty clear who's writing the history about this fell god here.
True.
The many mentions of this god as evil clearly come about because fire itself was just this extremely taboo topic during Marika's Age of the Erd Tree. And it's not just Giant's Flame items that mention this. Fire in general was prohibited to those who served the Erd Tree, which was a pretty smart defensive measure.
Right,
especially
since trees are
considering that
allergic to
many
fire.
rival outer gods also have a flame of their own. The Formless Mother has Blood Flame, the Three Fingers have Frenzied Flame, the outer god of death has Ghost Flame, but Giant's Flame in particular was capable of burning the Erd Tree, and that is a fact that clearly inspired the inevitable war with the giants. So the giants were deemed mortal enemies of the Erd Tree.
Indeed, and you need to get the giant's
Their allegedly
flame in order to
desolated
burn the Erd
nature
Tree.
Triggered avalanches and
So-
whipped up storms of flame with their roars. Clearly those who served the Erd Tree were afraid, and perhaps rightfully so. And so, led by Lord Godfrey, the forces of the Erd Tree went to war. The fire giants borrowed from the power of the Fell God to fight against the Erd Tree, but were defeated nonetheless. According to the Burn O' Flame incantation, this released the fire giants from their curse to serve as keepers of the flame, all except one, who the Fell God still hides within. And upon realizing that the giant's flame would never die, Marika left this last giant alive, knowing it was bound to protect the flame for all eternity, and thus leaving it cursed. Cursed to protect the flame from someone like us. In addition to the
Someone
Knights
like
of
us.
Zamor, many
Indeed.
lesser giants were also roped into the war against the fire giants. These lesser giants are called trolls, and are confirmed to be a race that is descended from the giants. This relationship is clearer at the mountaintops, where the trolls here still cast Giant's Flame incantations. Troll hammers were even once used as ancient ceremonial smithing tools. Thus, it seems evident that the trolls and the fire giants coexisted for a time, and then fell further and further apart. Because while some
Right, 'cause
trolls are
the
assumedly
giants
still
are
fire
gone.
giants at heart, many now are not. In fact, at the heart of most trolls is nothing. There's this suspicious hollow here, almost
There's
as
something
if
in there.
has been ripped out of their torso. And when you consider
Yeah,
what's
their
upon
heart.
the torso of the last remaining fire giant, the truth becomes pretty clear, right? Every single troll is now missing that giant eye of their outer god.
Oh.
And if you manage to look really closely here at a troll,
Yeah, you see it like
we
a little
realize that
tome.
in its place is this strange stone tablet that is held in place by what look like roots. As pointed out by Quelaag, these rooted tablets are very reminiscent of the rooted shackles that were created to bind the Omen twins, Moog and Morgoth. Which
Interesting.
might suggest that the trolls are also being shackled or suppressed by Marika in some way. This is just speculation, of course, but Marika does have this suspicious set of stone tablets in her chambers, and I think it's a good theory, for sure.
Yeah.
A sword
Sounds good
gravestone
enough to
in the
me.
mountaintops elaborates further on the trolls' role in the War of the Giants. Here, champions battled.
Illuminati confirmed.
Allegedly, the trolls betrayed. But what was the nature of this betrayal? Did these lesser giants resent their larger kin? Or did Marika force this betrayal in some way with the stone shackles? I think that's largely up to you guys. But whatever the case, nowadays the trolls are said to have lost their minds and are inseparable from
So we
the
fix
weight
the
of their
cheeks.
rusty swords, which have long since lost any
Now
trace
let's
of gold. So whether they
carve the
carry
noses
coffins
into
or
shape.
mine down at the bedrock of the earth, their sad state brings to mind enslavement now, more than anything else. That said, some trolls do seem to have a little bit more dignity, and these are the ones that fought against the Erd Tree later on. These were the enchanted troll knights, deemed comrades of the young Renala.
Enchanted walnuts.
They were called into service when the queen invoked an oath that they swore long ago. As mentioned earlier, the trolls go way back to when the fire giants and the astrologers were still neighbors, and back then it seems, for whatever reason, they swore an
Okay,
oath.
so let's look at this nose here.
Later, when the Carrions went to war against the Erd Tree, I assume,
Yes.
the trolls were finally called into that service to be treated as true knights of Caria, wielding swords
You got this
embedded
little
with
flat
glintstone
spot
and
here.
summoning enormous glint blades.
Little
They fought
burb.
arm in arm with their long-lost human comrades. Iji is another such example of that relationship, by the way. He became the Carrion family's royal blacksmith, and unlike the Stone Digger trolls, he actually uses that weapon for its intended purpose, as a blacksmith's hammer, and now he serves the Lady Rani, who he's known ever since her childhood. Next, I want to talk about the Knights Cavalry. These recurring bosses wander the dim roads at
Yeah,
night,
what's up with those
and
guys?
were once led by the Fell Omen. Now, this description specifically references Margit's title as the Fell Omen, not Morgoth's title as the Omen King, and I think this is important because Margit represents this undercover extension of Morgoth, who scouts further out in the world and takes out champions who approach all the way from Stormvale Castle. Morgoth's big role in the story is that he's a stout defender of the Erd Tree who wouldn't dare betray the Golden Order. He
Your
calls
mother's
all the other
stout
demigods
defender of the Erd
willful
Tree.
traitors all, simply for fighting over
Got
the
him.
great runes of the Elden Ring. Even Radahn, who has a lot
It's
of
a little
signs
too
of
wet
being
right now.
quite loyal to the Golden Order, is called a traitor, simply because he fights at one stage another character who has a great rune. You can even see Morgoth in one of these opening cutscene cinematics leaping onto what looks like Radahn and managing to even get an attack off on one of the mightiest of the demigods. Actually, a channel named Smotown has a really good little video discussing whether this is indeed Radahn, and I'd highly recommend you go and check that out. Anyway, my point is, the Knights Cavalry seem to fulfill a similar role to Margit. According to their armor, they were deliverers of death for great warriors, knights, and champions. Simple as that. No motive is listed, except that they have a reputation
basically
for taking out
assassins.
the greatest warriors of
If you
the world.
become too
And
strong,
that makes sense that that would be their
they
aim,
come kill you.
because only the strongest can acquire 2 great runes and approach the Erd Tree, so it's almost as if strength itself must be stifled so that Morgoth's failing order might be maintained. As for why Margit defends Stormvale, I like to think that he's fighting here because he recognizes that
He's a little
Godric is
bitch.
the weakest of the demigods, who yet remains. So he's bolstering his strength in that sense and trying to maintain
Okay, so
unsteady
this is a little
stalemate.
too dry.
Having a strong defense is essentially the
Getting that
guiding principle of
balance
those who serve the
is
Erdtree,
difficult with this cheap
especially
clay.
as you get closer to the capital. There are numerous examples of this. The soldiers of Leyndell fight their battles defensively. The knights of Leyndell always put their shield
Needs to be a little more
before the
bulbous,
sword. And
less
Leyndell
wide,
itself,
more
the city,
bulbous.
is built to withstand siege, with layers and layers of defensive measures built in. And the protective standard to which all defenders of the Erdtree aspire is that of the Tree Sentinels, whose order became the living rampart of the Erdtree, embellished with golden tree-crested armor and shields that can retaliate with bolts of light. They turn defense into offense. And that's the idea in Leyndell. Defense is the best offense. And the way this idea is presented is just such beautiful storytelling. So many characters in other areas of the Lands Between long to return to the blessed land of the Erdtree, and even for you it's this goal that looms over you the entire game. So the path is designed to repel everyone getting close. You know, the highway through Leonia has fallen apart, so you need to take this secret, waterlogged route up through the mountain. This was my favorite part of the game, by the way, finding this secret path through the mountains and infiltrating the Altus Plateau. And then when you finally get there, there are countless ballista and golem archers, and they're all positioned facing outwards. And finally, you even find a side entrance to Leyndell, and that is even guarded by a tree sentinel. And it's not just any tree sentinel. This one is actually a draconic tree sentinel, which is kind of different. This variant of sentinels arose after the ancient
Oh yeah, he does
dragons
have like
attacked
weird
Leyndell
gold
in
armor.
its history. And we talk more about this event in the video about the demigods.
Like tarnished,
In the
almost.
end, the ancient dragons were befriended, and worship of the ancient dragons was deemed acceptable, alongside belief in the Erdtree. Dragons were conjoined with the Golden Order, so to speak, and the dragon cultists took after them in a physical fashion. Also instrumental to the rise of the Erdtree were the Crucible Knights. They were eventually scorned for their strength, for their appearance, and for their close resemblance to Chaos, and how that inspired who they originally were. 16 of these knights served Godfrey, the first Elden Lord, and all 16 of them yet remain across the Lands Between. One is imprisoned in an Everjail, 2 appear to be dead and are summoned to fight you as spirits. A number of Crucible Knights still patrol Leyndell, some protect great tree roots, though most just stand dejected in lost corners of the earth, and one of them has even found a new blasphemous master. So, the next time you fight these, think carefully about where they are and
A new
who they're fighting
blasphemous
with,
master.
because each knight is a distinct character, with purpose, or lack thereof, even though they were all once united by a common purpose and a single lord. Many of these knights fight with different aspects of the Crucible. Some fight with wings,
His nostrils
some
giving
with
me
horns,
issues. It's a weird
fire,
angle.
tail, but what they all have in common is their mastery of their Lord Godfrey's signature stomp attack, which breaks up the earth beneath their feet. This is such a cool homage to Godfrey. You know, knowing the lore is great. It definitely makes dying to it feel a little bit better, right? Anyway, I think it's important to remember that Godfrey and his Crucible Knights existed in an age before the Erdtrees, an age with the Great Tree in its primordial form, back when there was this red-tinted crucible of life, and these were warriors who drew power from its chaos. Eventually, however, they were brought on board with order, which is best exemplified by Godfrey being tamed by the Beast Regent upon his back. There are 2 types of ornamentation that the Crucible Knights can have. There's axe ornamentation, which is worn by Crucible Knight Ordovus and his men, and I think the axe is a bit of a homage to Godfrey again. And then there are some knights that have great tree ornamentation, and these are displayed by the Knight Soluria and her men, which is of course a reference to the Great Tree itself. And I'd like to quickly talk about the Great Tree. In one of my first lore videos, I proposed that there was a great tree that must have existed before the Erdtree, and that the Erdtree might have even replaced this great tree. This was based on the English root resin item description, which has the word great tree capitalized and as one word, which certainly makes you think that it's a distinct tree, right? The line is, the roots of the great tree once linked to those of the Erd tree, which is a line that seems to clearly set up that these are two separate trees. Except the Japanese translation doesn't say that. The Japanese translation says, these roots are said to have once been connected to the golden tree. It does mention the great tree earlier, but it seems to just be referencing the Erd tree as that great tree, because it is a really big tree.
It's the great pumpkin.
Some people have taken this to mean that there was no great tree before the Erd tree, and, you know, while that's certainly possible, I do think it's still fair to argue that a great tree existed before the Erd tree. For one, many of the Crucible Knight items reference a primordial form of the Erd tree, and they have ornamentation and history that is based on this primordial holiness that is not the holiness of the Erd tree.
Did trees just not exist? Are all the trees aliens?
That tree. And secondly, Siluria defends a giant tree in the deep root depths.
Trees aren't real?
One that has this hollowed out entrance that is reminiscent of the entrance at the Erd tree as well, so maybe there's something here. I just kind of wanted to set that straight for now. But the reality is that we don't really know for sure, and hopefully DLC will shed a light on some of these past ages of the
Praise
world.
the DLC.
Seems to be a common trend with From Software DLC, and there just really are so many remnants of previous ages in this game, and I'd love to see a little bit more about what their cultures really were like. It kind of makes you resent just how all-encompassing the Erd tree became. So many of these cultures have been lost, and I guess that's how a lot of characters in-game feel as well. They feel upset by that, and knowing this fact helps you understand why so many of these characters are okay with burning down the Erd tree.
Yeah, they're like, fuck this thing.
And this brings us to our next boss, because
praise our Lord instead.
Burning down the Erd tree, you release a slew.
Alright, so if I go like this,
these spirits,
and then just mash this right here
until you come along.
That's what
but
it
of course, you
looks
fight
like,
many of
you know?
these tree spirits across the lands between, even before the end game. There's an ulcerated tree spirit at the husk of this minor Erd tree. There's a bunch in catacomb dungeons by great tree roots. There's even one at the husk of the Halig tree. There's a lot of these. Some might even say there's too many of these bosses. I think they're the worst boss in Elden Ring. But anyway, understanding their lore might make it a bit more palatable. So, while these creatures fight near the trees, I don't think they're defending them. Rather, I kind of think they're this corrupted byproduct of dead or dying trees. We know that one of the new purposes of the Erd tree is to accept spirits and allow them to live on. It's almost like these ulcerated spirits are this horrific failure.
Trying to get that angle that the picture's at.
One of Miyazaki's favorite themes in these games is the idea that life is not supposed to be eternal, and I think these spirits are a physical manifestation of stagnation and decay. They're this product of an age of an Erd tree that really should have ended a long time ago. Most tree spirits drop golden seeds, which are also found at the base of smaller illusory trees, and they read, "When the Elden Ring was shattered, these seeds flew from the Erd tree, scattering across the various lands, as if life itself knew that its end had come."
Little teeny wet napkin.
Say, the Erd tree was once
Just
perfect
a
and
little
eternal, and thus it was believed that Erd tree seeds
we want to fuse that.
This was back when there was an age of plenty.
Not make it lose that little.
Literally dripped from the boughs of the Erd tree like sap, and the Erd tree's warm light healed those who bathed.
I don't know what the word is.
The Erd tree flourished with abundance, yet it was only for a fleeting moment. Such is the course of all life.
Alright, so
then
we take this, we go like this.
As you know from the introduction and the endings,
take this one.
Leaves tell a story. The story is that the Erd tree was withering. Scattered across the lands between are minor Erd trees, where you go to collect crystal tears. Basins were placed at the feet of minor Erd trees in order to collect these tears, though in some cases these tears are dropped by Erd tree avatars instead. When the Elden Ring was shattered, the avatars emerged, wielding ceremonial staffs that depict the Erd tree in its historic radiance. These creatures are the will of the dying Erd tree, made manifest, I think. They are literally part tree, after all, and they fight desperately to protect the minor Erd trees, which are the offspring of the withering Erd tree itself. Some avatars placed in Caelid and Miquella's Halig tree are rotten avatars, and they even have this uniquely designed staff that festers with rot, just as they do. Remember, the Halig tree is also an emulation of the Erd tree, so it makes sense that it has its own avatars as well. And they fight on, because to many of these creatures, any Erd tree, whether it's minor or a copy or doomed, is something worth protecting. So, if you've made it all the way to the end
Every
of this
tree
video,
is worth
then
protecting.
chances are you love this kind of long-form content, so an Audible subscription might also be just right for you. Sign up
No,
at
probably not.
audible.com/VartiVidya or text VartiVidya
I got
to
plenty of
500,
subscriptions,
500,
buddy.
and you'll get a free credit for the first month, and then again for every paid month thereafter. But this time, I'd recommend you spend that credit on The Sandman, which might be just one of
I don't
the
even know how
most
to.
unique
Oh, I don't have to.
audiobooks that you've
But
ever
isn't that a
listened
TV
to.
show anyway?
It has its own cast
have to
of
listen to
voice
shit.
actors, including the author, Neil Gaiman himself, who narrates, as well as sound effects and music. It's an incredible introduction to the story that a lot of people...
If you wanted to get people into this shit, should have
Have a listen
narrated the
and see what
fucking
I mean.
Netflix show.
The year was 1916. Roderick
It's a little late
Burgess
now.
conceived a plan. In my power, he would capture death.
A little late now.
Did Burgess know what he had got?
Damn you! You are death.
At last, finally, I am free.
So, if you'd like access to this or to thousands of other audiobooks or podcasts, then visit audible.com/VartiVidya or text VartiVidya to 500 500. Thank you to Audible for sponsoring this video, and thank you for watching. I think everyone had this moment in Elden Ring. You find a building hidden in the forest of Limgrave's Mistwood, and the door mysteriously opens of its own volition to reveal an elevator down that just keeps going and going, on and on, until you forget that you're even underground. The cavernous roof is now so far above that it might as well be a false night
The
sky.
aqueduct area.
And the world below
That place was
has
cool.
life, light, and a culture of its own. But what's interesting about the environment down here is that it's actually a fusion of cultures. There are the dynastic remains infested with claymen, and then there's the ancestral grounds brimming with wildlife. But built amidst it all, between the ruins, beyond the ancestral grounds, and even hanging from the ceilings, are the incredible eternal cities inhabited by the Nox.
Okay, so we don't even have to worry about the lip because it's just a bunch of hair sticking out of his nose.
Monks, swordstresses, and night maidens of the eternal city.
We just need to work on the little
The word Nox
cheek droops.
means night in Latin. Some of you might remember this from the phrase Verio Nox in Dark Souls, which was commonly held to mean fear the night. And this theme has carried over to Elden Ring, where fear and respect for the night is conveyed by characters like Rani, who seek to usher in an age of stars.
Here beginneth the chill night that encompasses all, reaching the great beyond. Into fear, doubt, and loneliness.
And just like the Age of Dark in Dark Souls, the coming Age of Stars is presented as a bit of an inevitability in Elden Ring. Or at least it might have been, were it not for Star-Scourge Radahn, who locked the stars out of motion and fettered the fate once writ in the night sky on behalf of the Golden Order. Again, this is just like in Dark Souls, where the coming Age of Dark was stolen from mankind by a greater power. Yet, even now, the Age of Stars continues to be championed by a people called the Nox. Except now, the Nox have been banished to the underground,
Ooh.
and here
Banished
they
the
live in
Nox.
this state of eternal anticipation, just endlessly waiting for a
A lot
fate
of banishing
that has
going
been
on here.
taken away from them. We're never explicitly told which act it was that led to the Nox's banishment, but my best guess is that it has to do with this, the Fingerslayer blade, which we loot beneath the giant's throne in Nokron.
Yeah,
Part of its
it's
description
good
reads,
chance.
This blood-drenched fetish is proof of the high treason committed by the Eternal City and symbolizes its downfall. So, What was the nature of the Nox's high treason, then? Well, this is a finger slayer blade, one that is able to harm the Greater Will and its vassals. This blade is drenched in blood and proof of high treason, so it seems like the weapon was successfully used, but we can only really speculate on which pair of two fingers this blade might have been used on.
Yeah, probably those
Of
dead
course,
ones.
it might have just been high treason to create this blade in the first place. This weapon is said to be born of a corpse, so let's take a closer look at its icon. Doing so reveals a spine running up the blade and two arms that form the hilt. So clearly this weapon is born of a corpse, but it's not the only weapon in game that's like this. Remember that moment at the end of the game where the Elden Beast reaches into the ground and pulls a sword from Radagon's corpse? That is the Sacred Relic Sword, and it too is a spined spiral blade with a human forming the hilt. So to some in this item's description, this weapon represents the end of an age, and to others, the beginning.
Interesting.
Now, I kind of doubt that the Finger Slayer blade is made from a corpse that's as powerful as Radagon, just because it seems so much smaller, broken, and limp. But regardless, it clearly was an attempt to bring about the end of one age and the beginning of another. Just so, the Finger Slayer blade can only be wielded by Rani, who needs the weapon to claim her fate and achieve her ending. But this can only happen when you defeat Radahn and unlock the fate in the night sky, because doing so sets free a star from the cosmos, which crashes into Limgrave, revealing the path to Nokron, the Eternal City, where the Finger Slayer blade lies hidden.
Indeed.
There are multiple Eternal Cities that are spread widely across the lands between and located deep beneath the earth. First, we have the city of Nokron that lies beneath Limgrave. The entrance to this city is torn open by Radahn's meteorite when we explore it, so all of the foremost buildings are ruined, but they form the path leading to this undisturbed, multi-layered city that's sort of tucked behind the dynastic remains and the ancestral environs that were built here long before. Then there's Nokron's twin, the city of Nokstella, which is located beneath Liurnia. I think most people would have got their first hint of this city when they wound up in the Ainzel River fighting the dragonkin soldier of Nokstella, but the true city is further up from here, stretching out between long sections of ant-infested tunnels. Here, the Nox have actually learned how to ride these ants, though the ants will happily turn on them if given the chance. But there's a third city, a completely devastated, nameless city located beneath Leyndell, which is a place we'll have to talk about a little bit later in this video. These three cities just have incredible architecture. I love Nokron's massive inverted
Nokron's
towers.
awesome. It's
cool how Nokstella's shining city is built right into this low-hanging false night sky. Now, the game isn't really clear on whether these cities existed before the Nox's banishment underground, or if they were built afterwards. However, I'm inclined to think that they actually existed before their banishment. Take the Fingerslayer Blade's description, for instance. This weapon is the most likely reason for the Nox's banishment, and it lays the high treason at the feet of the Eternal City. It doesn't blame the Nox, who would have existed above ground at some point. It blames the Eternal City. But regardless, while they at least might have already had these well-developed cities down here, their banishment was still a brutal punishment, because the Nox would have been cut off from the true night sky, which was a core part of their culture. As some small comfort
looks about right. It looks good enough, in my opinion.
False night skies, which are made of suspended white fragments.
And that's all that matters.
This they accept as they wait for the Age of Stars to begin. In order to learn more about these cities, though, I'd like to look at some data mined information. Of course, you have to take this with a grain of salt, but in version 1.0 of Elden Ring, the Eternal City buildings are frequently listed as Marika's Ruins, and the Eternal City pavilions are Marika's Pavilions. What's more, the Nox themselves are actually called Marika's Descendants.
Nokron's going to end up being more relevant in the DLC.
So let's try to break down Marika's ancestry and see if we can arrive at the Nox. So, Marika herself is of the Numen race, who, according to the character creation screen, are supposed descendants of denizens of another world. The only other supposed Numen in-game are the Black Knife Assassins, who, according to their silver armor, were all women and rumored to be Numen, who had close ties with Marika herself. And we have proof that these Numen Black Knives were tied to the Eternal Cities.
They say the assassins who carried out the deed were scions of the Eternal City.
The droopy
So if we
nose
take
goops
Roger at his word,
make it look
then
old.
it seems like Numen
Like an
are
old
indeed
man.
tied up with the genealogy of the Eternal City, and that Marika herself is likely one of the Nox's ancestors. You could go as far as to say that Marika is actually from an Eternal City too. She is called the Eternal, after all, but again, remember this is data mined information that we're not really supposed to know. But at any rate, while the Nox might be descended from the Numen, I think enough time has passed that most Nox aren't really considered Numen anymore. If anything, they're now more akin to the Night Folk, which is actually another descendancy you can choose for your Tarnished in the character creator. Night Folk and Nox share similarly hued skin, and Night Folk are a race that was said to bleed silver long ago. So let's finally actually talk about the Nox monks, the priestesses, the Night Maidens, and the silver that they wield. The monks of the Eternal Cities are all men, and they fight with flowing weapons of liquid metal. So too do the swordstresses, a female.
Yeah, I tried using that Nox mace for a little while. It was super cool, but like I wasn't spec'd for it.
The Night Maidens themselves are said to be of the highest clerical rank, and it's definitely interesting that a group of maidens would be of the highest clerical rank. It's almost as if the Night Maidens exist as a sort of parallel to the Kindling Maidens of the Two Fingers, who serve the Tarnished so that they might become Lord. Because remember, a core part of the Nox culture is also about searching for a Lord to serve. Except unlike the title Elden Lord, the Nox are waiting for a Lord of Night. In a way, this Lord of Night is almost an imitation of the Elden Lord.
Okay, let's get a little chop right here.
Extremely well versed in the art of imitation. So let's talk about that.
And then we blend.
A lot of us here when I say that a core part of so many of our late game playthroughs were the Mimic tier Spirit Ashes, which copy the form of their summoner. And from a lore point of view, the whole point of this Mimic tier is actually to mimic the Tarnished who might become the Elden Lord. Its description reads, Mimic tiers are a result of an attempt by the Eternal City to forge a Lord. However, the description also says that their mimicry does not extend to imitating the summoner's will. This makes it seem like Mimic tiers are this tool, right? They're something to be used to achieve the Eternal City's ends. So it's important to point out here that Mimic tiers are actually more accurately Silver tiers, and Silver tiers literally are tools, because they're wielded by the Nox as weapons. The Nox Flowing Hammer and the Nox Flowing Sword are forged from the liquid metal of Silver tiers and tempered to hardness. This gives them the ability to extend, bend, and when wielded by the Nox, to drastically change their form into spiked shields and even giant hands. And what's kind of chilling to realize is that these weapons are actually living beings. This is all quite clearly inspired by ancient alchemical conceptions of mercury, or quicksilver, which was this compound that was believed to be able
the nose to dry a bit more so I can carve it out
and solid states,
with this thingy.
Life and death. In game, Silver tiers are called formless life, able to be reborn again and again into imitation. They are as much a substance as they are a living organism, and we see this in their multitude of forms: silver spheres, trolls, and even nightfolk, to name but a few. There's even this entire cut questline that would have had you bond with a silver mimic tier called Asimi. In the cut dialogue files, this mimic tier claims to have grown a desire for life and knowledge and lordship, and she desires to share the throne with you.
You could have become Elden Lord, and I could have become Sovereign Eternal.
I think, and I know a lot of you guys did as well when I mentioned this last time, I think this would have gone a really long way towards making players relate to the story of the Nox.
Indeed, yeah. They try to make you care about the jellyfish, and then
and
that was it. It's like, wait a minute.
I can definitely see why mimic tears and artificial life might have been this enormous threat to the Erd Tree's authority. The Nox were, after all, messing with these crucial things that the Erd Tree had come to govern. They were messing with the powers of life, death, and rebirth. Of course, we know that death was sacrosanct to the Erd Tree during its age. As I discussed in my video on death, many ancient methods of death came to be abandoned or shunned in favor of returning to the Erd Tree's roots instead, through the process
of fucking weirdos.
All the old ways of death were abandoned. And as for rebirth, well, the Erd Tree is never really explicitly said to be able to rebirth beings. I think a lot of people just assume that it's implied, but there is a bit of evidence. Many depictions of the Erd Tree actually show human forms growing along its branches, just as they show.
And when you go down, you see all those corpses up in the roots.
By its roots. And you can't forget that an entire Great Rune of the Elden Ring explicitly governs rebirth. This is Renala's Amber Egg, and inside it is the Great Rune of the Unborn.
In the end, Lady Renala was left alone, cradling the Amber Egg Lord Radagon bequeathed her. Now she devotes herself to it through forbidden rite, the grim art of reincarnation.
I think Miriel calls Renala's reincarnation a grim act here, because reincarnation already has a bit of a history with the Nox in the Lands Between, and Renala isn't the Erd Tree, so I can see how what she's doing might be a bit sacrilegious. She's even capable of using larval tears from the Eternal City, so Miriel, speaking as any follower of the Erd Tree would, understandably decries.
So let's get the bulby nose back, and the shape on the nose, nostrils.
I stumbled upon cut dialogue from Thops, who
you stop messing with these damn cheeks.
Like this
Move on.
Did indeed
Move on.
originate in the Eternal City.
It'll all come together once we get more features going.
Forbidden rights is the same phrase used for Renala and by Thops as well.
Oh,
maybe let's do the eyes.
Beware the Albinorics, accursed souls born of a forbidden rite of the Eternal City.
Eyes are easy.
Albinorics seem to be a reference to the ancient notions of artificial life, and that's something that's supported by the Albinoric blood clot description, which calls them life forms made by human hands. According to the Albinoric shield, Albinorics are said to have been created from a primordial drop of dew, which, to me, evokes the Erd Tree's own imagery of dew, where drops of life dripped from the Erd Tree's branches. It's sort of imitation in that way to me. The ripple blade that is wielded by young Albinorics echoes this, stating that ripples are thought to be at the origin of their species.
Okay.
Obviously, these are all references to liquid, and it suggests that Albinorics are born of the same liquid silver that we just discussed.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean,
the silver set also confirms
they look
this,
like it.
Calling Albinorics children of silver. And there are a few different types of Albinoric that can be encountered in-game. There are first-generation Albinorics who have withered legs and are called the Albinorics of old. And then there are second-generation Albinorics who resemble frogs and are called the young Albinorics.
Yeah, those dudes.
Let's discuss these first-generation Albinorics first. As far as enemy models go, there are the men, who are commonly the subject of torture and genocide, and then there are the women, who seem to have learned to defend themselves as Albinoric wolfback archers. This is probably a good time to mention, this isn't the only example in this video where the women of the culture are far more dexterous than the men. All of the Black Knives are women, the Nox Swordstresses defend the Knight Maidens, who are of the highest rank, and if we're talking about rank, then Caria and its princesses as well are a prime example of that. Speaking of Caria, actually, Pidia is an example of an Albinoric man that serves Caria, and other Albinoric men in Caria have clearly learned glintstone sorcery, not to mention Loretta, but maybe that's the story for another time. Moving on.
Why another time? Why not this time?
Generation Albinorics. As newer Albinorics in the lands between, the formula for these artificial humans seems to have been improved, as they now have legs, which they put to comically good use, although Thops in his cut dialogue does say that they've lost the use of their tongues. So they really haven't got the formula quite right. There's something also going on with their heads, which From Software themselves call dumpy and frog-like. You can even loot the Albinoric mask, which is literally just their own face, skin.
Yeah, it's not a mask, that's just a face.
Malicious mockery. And I really shouldn't laugh, but it is kind of funny, admittedly, that even Elden Ring players are also guilty of genociding helpless Albinorics. There's this site in Mogwin Palace where it's just far and away the best way to farm runes.
I thought I discovered this and I was a genius, and then I went online and everyone was already doing it.
Gameplay matching lore. Anyway, with all of this terrible shit happening to Albinorics, frankly, just for the sheer audacity of them simply existing, it's no surprise that they see Miquella's Haligtree as a haven, but in talking about that, we're getting far away from the Eternal Cities.
So let's do...
So it appears the Eternal Cities won't contain
this sort of thing?
just birthing Silver Tears and Albinorics, because the Dragonkin, too, were born in the Eternal City. There are a tragic few that
want to give it like a natural wrinkle
Unlike
here.
The real stone dragons up above, they knew no true sky nor true lightning. It seems these Dragonkin
And
were
it looks like I
created,
achieved
think,
it.
with the intent of achieving a sort of immortality. Something that is suggested by the Dragon Scale Blade, which is an ice lightning weapon that reads, a weapon made by sharpening a gravel stone scale, thought to be the source of ancient dragon immortality.
Excellent. It's got like an old man poofy eyelid
Alas,
effect
the Dragonkin
going.
soldiers never attained immortality,
Perfecto.
and perished as decrepit, pale imitations of their skyborn kin. There's the word imitation again. And interestingly, just like the Finger Slayer Blade is this hidden treasure of the Eternal City that is capable of harming the Greater Will, ancient dragon smithing stones too are a hidden treasure of Faram Azula, capable of creating weapons that can slay a god. So, like so many other things in this video, the Dragonkin almost seem like they are imitations that were born with a malign purpose. But just like Renala's children, and the first-gen Albinorics, these imperfect births only led to withered legs and a pitiful existence.
Sad.
And now we
Sad,
finally
sad,
arrive
pitiful
at the third
existence.
city, the nameless Eternal City, which is located deep beneath the Erd Tree at the Deeproot depths, and it's lost its sky, its name, and even all traces of the Nox. And I believe we know exactly what is to blame for all of this. Astel, Bastard of the Void, is responsible.
Bastard of the
According to
Void.
Astel's
What?
remembrance,
I haven't
is
heard
a
that fucking
malformed
name
star,
yet.
born in the lightless void far away. And
I heard
with all
Astel the
force
malformed
of a
star.
falling meteor, it seems, Astel destroyed an Eternal City.
But
and took
Bastard
away
of the
their
Void?
sky. Logically, this nameless Eternal
Some
City
strong words
is
there,
that
yeah.
Eternal City he destroyed, since it's absolutely devastated and it is missing its false night sky. And when the description says Astel took away their sky, I believe that's really literal. I think Astel really did take it away, far away, because we don't fight Astel anywhere near the nameless Eternal
Indeed, we
City.
fight him deep under the
it away
fucking
from
ground.
itself, almost as if Astel ruined the nameless city, then flowed all the way down the Ainsel River to the south, past Noxtella, and into an enormous cavern where it set up a suspiciously familiar night sky. The Eternal Darkness spell tells us that it's this manifestation of the despair around the ruin of the Eternal City, and the spell in question is essentially this black hole with
We'll just pretend this is where the hair is.
force drawing everything into it. The Astel don't seem like these super sentient beings to me, so what if they were mere animals, just drawn towards a sort of black hole, or maybe towards another powerful gravitational force, like a moon? Which brings us back to the city of Noxtella. Exploring Noxtella's tallest towers rewards you with the legendary Moon of Noxtella talisman, a treasure of theirs that represents the lost Black Moon. This moon apparently was once the guide of countless stars, and might have served as a sort of artificial moon below ground. But tragically, it seems this black moon was shattered into pieces, because fragments of this moon can be found in memory stones, which
mush that
really
up in there.
gameplay function to the
Extra
talisman,
material.
granting you additional memory slots. These stones are rightfully treasured by sorcerers, and above ground, towers evoking those of the Eternal City would be built to protect these precious artifacts. I'm not sure how these fragments were stolen from the city, though over in Nokron there are examples of foreign forces making incursions into the city. These beings are members of the Company of the Fallen Hawk, a company of slaves that were ordered to explore the Eternal City. Logically, these soldiers are slaves of the Golden Order, but who were the Fallen Hawks before their enslavement? Well, there's this one little theory that I quite like by user NoContribution15 on Reddit that suggests that these Fallen Hawks could have once been common soldiers of Stormvale Castle, because these soldiers once had hawk crest shields and even a Stormhawk king, dating back to ancient times, back when there was a true storm in Stormvale. And so, as the theory goes, the crest for this company became that.
So another forgotten and long-lost fucking
symbolizing their
faction,
fall
huh?
and perhaps referencing the inverted towers of the Eternal City that they were doomed to explore. As for why they explore the city, the first thing that comes to mind is that they might have been sent here to look for the Fingerslayer Blade, which is the hidden treasure of Nokron, where the Fallen Hawks were sent, although this is mostly all just speculation. Whatever the case, it really helps to characterize these enemies for you. Otherwise, the only other observation we can make is that many of the Fallen Hawks can be found digging hopelessly in the ground, hands bloodied by their long efforts to this day. Torches are an important part of their design, and this reinforces the idea that they're here looking for something. To the
Well,
point
yeah,
where
obviously.
the band's last embers were used up in their long
They look so
search,
crazy.
and then
Their
they
one
began to
eyelid.
burn the bones of their fellows, acquiring the cold ghost flame. And with this new flame in hand, they became dwellers of the underground for all eternity. Like with the Fallen Hawks, there are some really open-ended parts to the stories of the Eternal Cities, some things that are curiosities to me, and I welcome you to try and answer them. For example, the giant thrones, with the giant Nox skeletons on them, they're almost a complete mystery, I think. The only place the game references these thrones are in the symbols for night sorceries, and bubble sorceries as well. Beyond that, they're clearly a central part of Nox culture, though we don't know what purpose these beings had. Below each one, though, you can loot Great Ghost Glovewort, which were given in tribute to those who died the most glorious of deaths, in the hope their stories would become legend. So it seems the Nox not only venerated these beings with giant thrones, but that their spirits as well were considered to be heroic, for
Indeed.
their deaths were glorious. Another curiosity is the distorted bodies that are
Yeah,
found
you don't
with
see
the
many
Eternal
spirit
Cities.
ashes
These
with
are
like
from the
a description
ground
that's like,
and many
this was
buildings as
just
well.
some fucking
Nox.
guy. He wasn't special at all.
Are the
No, they were all
inhabitants of the
like
city? Are their deaths
someone
related to
important.
giants? What are these? And finally, there are the gargoyles that are found in the nameless Eternal Cities, with misshapen, ruined bodies. None of these gargoyles have been mended, but those that are mended with black corpse wax.
I think the nose is pretty
They serve Malekith,
close.
the Black Blade. Many of you will remember that two valiant gargoyles defend the path from
Pretty
Nokron to the deepest
close.
depths where the nameless Eternal City is. And interestingly, it's a coffin that takes you up there, suspended on a golden script. This golden script reminds me of the description of the Cipher Pater, which reads, "The furtive inscription appears to hang in the air, the language of light spoken by the two fingers." It makes sense that the two fingers would be aligned with these gargoyles that serve Malekith, and maybe some power of the two fingers is what takes you up to.
Alright, now we gotta get these
Eternal City
eyelids.
in this coffin. Speaking of coffins, there's another coffin that you ride down from the Grand Cloister to Astel's lair, and there are a ton of coffins found in the Eternal Cities in general. Beyond being some absurd method of transport, perhaps sending remains along the river was some sort of burial rite? At any rate, many of these coffins have been waylaid along the Ainsel River tunnels, where ants feast upon the remains. And there's something fascinating going on with the ants as well. A lot of these have these enormous abdomens, These ants in particular are based off honeypot ants, which essentially function in nature as these living sources of food storage for the colony. And the Elden Ring variant drop one of the most valuable runes in the Lands Between. They drop a Newman's rune, which makes a lot of sense because these ants are feasting upon corpses, and we did speculate earlier that Newman are indelibly tied to the eternal cities. I could speculate further, but again, I'd welcome your thoughts on these curiosities.
Okay, that should do for an eyelid ridge.
Exploring the Lands Between in the modern era, it's clear that the Eternal Cities have had this significant cultural impact upon many things that we find above ground. You can take the walking mausoleums, for example. These have really explicit Eternal City architecture, which is something that you can't help but notice when you see one of them wandering down in the nameless Eternal City. These mausoleums, it seems, were appropriated from the Eternal Cities to house the remains of soulless demigods of the Golden Order, something that suddenly became very necessary to do after Godwyn's death. And this tracks because the Eternal Cities do have a bit of a history with spirits. We mentioned earlier that they entomb their heroic
now let's blend these eyelids in.
Glovewort, but even the rebirth monuments
because it is
above ground
preposterous.
that you need to summon spirits look kind of like Eternal City constructs. So I speculate that these might have been pioneered by the Nox, who, even if they didn't use these to summon spirits, they definitely might have used them to summon puppets, because puppetry is an invention of the Eternal Cities. To create a puppet of someone, you need them to drink a potion made of starlight shards, which are a prized item that was once used in the Eternal City as an ingredient in intoxicating draughts. Starlight shards are used for this because the stars command people's fates, and even the fates of the demigods, and so they can be used in potions given to create puppets with commanded fates. We know of two such puppets from the Eternal City, the Night Maiden and Swordstress puppets, who became puppets of their own volition. So keen were they, it seems, to serve the Eternal Cities. But when you look at all the puppet summons that you can get in Elden Ring, these two, the Night Maiden and the Swordstress of the Nox, these two are a bit of a special case because most puppets we find are actually controlled against their will and are extremely unwilling to serve their masters. An excellent example of this are the puppets that
but these ones are super eager.
Or should I say Pidia, who turn on him immediately when they're given the chance. These puppets are Knights of the Cuckoo, a faction that are explicitly aligned against Caria, and yet these knights are forced to fight on Caria's behalf here in Caria all the same. Carians also seem to have appropriated a lot of the tools of the Eternal Cities, like puppetry and inverted towers as well, which is only natural considering how much they actually have in common with the Eternal Cities. Carians are descended from astrologers, who also venerated the night sky. Another example of an invention of the Eternal Cities that the Carians use is found at the Church of Vows, which features a Nox statue taken straight out of the Eternal Cities. Here at the church, Radagon famously repented his territorial aggressions and cleansed himself with celestial dew. Celestial dew is another draft of the Eternal Cities. It's called a Night Tear, which reverses all antagonizations and moves fate backwards, in a sense, to a time or a feeling before those antagonizations took place.
Right, so if you attack an NPC,
faraway descendants of the Eternal would
you go and give it that shit and they'll suddenly forgive you.
As well. This is in Celia, within Caelid. Gowry calls Celians descendants of the Eternal.
But if you killed the NPC, well, you're fucked.
Thrones at the center of the city, there's also a couple of Nox bosses here. And finally, Celians were famed for their Knight class of sorceries, which their assassins made good use of. The Celians were also really proficient at turning invisible, which is an art that the Black Knives used, since they are, after all, also scions of the Eternal Cities. And it's just amazing how it all overlaps in the end. And in the end, another group would seek inroads to Nokron. This is when we play the game. These were Iji, Blythe, and Rani. Rani is a character that inherits all of the Nox's legacy. She becomes the final chapter in a story that they started to tell so long ago. prepare to cry, because I can't wait to cover her story properly, as it deserves. But before I go, I want to share a quick word about Audible. Speaking of people banished to the underground, I actually have the perfect audiobook to recommend to you guys today, and that's Metro 2033. New members
Metro 2023.
Just visit audible.com/VartiVidya or text VartiVidya to 500 500 to get your free trial started today. This is the story that inspired the video game of the same name, and it reveals this world where mankind are resigned to the train tunnels underground.
You don't need to read the book or listen to the book or just play the game, bro.
Radioactive wasteland. Bandits, monsters, and other horrors live below now in the tunnels, and listening to this audiobook will really transport you there. Check out this sample.
It made Artyom shudder to imagine the tunnel beyond the 700th meter. It was horrifying just to think about it.
That's a horrible voice.
Go beyond the 700th.
I don't want to listen to that guy talk to me for...
Patrols had made it to the 500th.
God knows how long this shit is.
Post with the spotlight on the trolley and convinced themselves that no scum had crossed it, they hastily returned. Even the scouts.
Sounds like a fucking robot that someone edited.
Stop at the 680th meter.
To not sound like a robot.
Burning cigarettes into their cupped palms and stand stock still, clinging to their night vision instruments. And then they'd slowly, quietly head back, without taking their eyes off
I'm half expecting to hear a chime sound and be like, turn the page.
The narrator for this title is really good, and they really nail the
like those
Russian
Teddy Ruxpin dolls.
Just the voice acting as well for your immersion. New members can listen to Audible free for 30 days. So, to listen to this, head to www.audible.com/VartiVidya or text VartiVidya to 500. Thank you to Audible for sponsoring this video, and thank you for watching. Long ago, an astrologer looked to the sky and found something called the
thousands of years ago,
in the stars above.
Before the dawn of man as we knew him.
What they saw in the cosmos actually manifested.
There was a great red-owl ape,
and the very amber of the stars rained
known
down
only as Sir Santa.
This glintstone of the cosmos would go on to inspire those that studied it, but there was also a darkness up there between the stars, and what some saw would break their minds and inspire a fate that was worse than death. This is the story of Elden Ring's cosmic sorcery, a force that would define an entire era of life in the lands between. It all began with the founding Reign of Stars, a legendary sorcery that was the founding glintstone sorcery. You might have missed this spell in your playthrough, but it's located here, hidden along an illusory path leading to the heretical rise within the mountaintops of the giants. Its description reveals that it is the eldest primeval sorcery, said to have been discovered by an ancient astrologer. Now, we don't know who this astrologer was, but we know they were not alone. For it was here, in these icy peaks closest to the sky, that the astrologers who preceded the sorcerers established themselves. And with ancient tools of astronomy, they looked to the cosmos above and read fate in the stars. But this was more than mere stargazing. The stars quite literally govern fates in Elden Ring. We learn this from the starlight shards and amber starlight items. The former is a pale blue shard. It's what remains of a passing flash of starlight, and the latter is the same, except it has a pale amber glow, and it tells of the belief that if the stars command our fates, then amber-hued stars must command the fates of the gods. During Celivis's questline, the blue starlight shards are distilled into this blue tonic, which can be given to other NPCs to turn them into summonable puppets. You are quite literally using starlight to forcibly control and take away their fates when you do this. These exact same intoxicating drafts had historically been used in the Eternal City, as is exemplified by the Night Maiden and Swordstress puppets, who actually chose this controlled fate for themselves, presumably so that they could better serve the needs of the Eternal
about
City.
this in the last
we can learn more about
episode.
that in this video, where we discuss the Eternal City in its entirety. But the Nox of the Eternal City weren't the only ones that were drawing power from the stars in this way. The royal house of Caria, too, drew great power from astrology. The telescope item, for example, is actually a smaller part of a larger astrological tool that was once used by members of the Carian royal family for their own brand of Carian astrology that revolved around Renala and the full moon rather than the stars. But to most, the moon was not considered equal to the stars, and it was actually the stars that most would draw upon for their sorcery.
Use the wetness to form more of that underlying, like, skull shape
that institutionalized the practice of glintstone sorcery. And this is our little triumvirate of three factions. There's the Nox and their descendants, there's the Carians, and there's the sorcerers of Raya Lucaria, who all trace their origins back to astrology. These factions overlap at times, they interact and clash, and their shared history is fascinating and complicated, but it all comes back to the cosmos in the end. But let's return once again to the founding reign of stars, which tells us that the glimpse of the primeval current that the ancient astrologers saw became a reality, and the stars' amber rained down on this land. But what exactly is the primeval current? Well, let's break down the term. The word current means it's a moving flow, or torrent, and the word primeval means that this torrential flow likely existed from the very beginning of time. And thanks to the description for Comet Azure, we know that the primeval current is a distant starry expanse, something that is visually similar to the
it's like an actual place
generated from this spell. But what's truly amazing about this cosmic force is that somehow this ancient astrologer managed to manifest a rain of stars upon the earth merely after glimpsing it in the primeval current of the cosmos far away. And I speculate that starlight shards are actually another example of this phenomenon. Their description reveals that these are what remains of a passing flash of starlight, and we exclusively loot these at the foot of giant stone astrolabes, which are these ancient stargazing tools. Thus, rather than being a piece of star that has fallen to the ground, I think these might be a byproduct of the act of looking up at the stars. Why else would we loot them?
It does seem to be implied.
So, in this same manner, first established with these starlight shards and then the founding rain of stars, glintstone sorcerers would go on to replicate this phenomenon, using their powers of comprehension to conceive of new cosmic elements that could be manifested in reality. Or put another way, they formulated spells that let them throw giant rocks at each other, and it was a huge hit with everyone. But among these glintstone sorcerers were some who wished to truly understand the mysteries of the primeval current, no matter the cost. These were sorcerers like Lusat and Azure, who would literally become crystal in order to sync up with
this needs a drought, just a wee bit,
these powers of the cosmos. And then there was Selen, the Graven Witch, who threw all ethics to the wind and wished to see humanity ascend no matter the cost. And make no mistake, the stars are alive, in a sense. Look at Estelle, for example. This is a malformed star, but a star nonetheless, birthed from a void, or so it is said. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Most sorcerers, it seems, would just be content with merely manifesting cosmic power, and so they would embed a piece of physical glintstone into a staff and then use that glintstone as a sort of catalyst for the stars above. And since glintstone was needed to channel spells, and since sorcerers needed glintstone to study, I think having access to physical glintstone would have been a really important thing. And luckily for the sorcerers, glintstone, being sourced from meteors and comets, had fallen to the lands between before. So these valuable crystals were mined and put to great use. And so atop and amidst enormous quantities of glintstone in the lakes of Leonia, a place of learning was built, an institution known as the Raya Lucaria Academy. Sorcerers as a whole were powerful. They could read fate in the stars, fire cosmic projectiles at their enemies, and potentially even command the fates of others. So, naturally, there needed to be an institution for their power, a place of learning, but also a place of hierarchy and even governance, where rules about sorcery could be debated and enforced. When you journeyed through Raya Lucaria, you would have collected these symbols of their institution. These are stone masks called glintstone crowns, and not just anyone is supposed to wear these crowns. They are a symbol of achievement, and they represent one's mastery of a certain conspectus or school of learning within the academy. They also make a good weapon, if all else fails. But why was this design specifically chosen as a symbol of achievement? Well, according to many item descriptions, there isn't just life in stone, but there is a wisdom contained in stone as well. So their masters were crafted with stone and set with glintstone. The glintstone is typically set upon the eyes and or the brain, a tradition that I speculate
so you need to let that
originated
mouthpiece
with the
dry
sorcerer
out a bit.
Who was one of the first, if not the first, glintstone sorcerer. His blue-green glintstone crown was set with crystals and eventually replaced his own brain and skull altogether, which enhanced his powers by helping him catalyze with glintstone, though it clearly came at great physical cost. And I speculate that this crown eventually replaced his own brain and skull, because glintstone kind of does that. It corrodes, it consumes. We see its effects best on other creatures like the dragon Smaragd, who was a devourer of sorcerers with a body that became corroded over time by their glintstones, thanks to that strict sorcerer diet. But as with Azure, this corrosion did not come without benefits, and he now breathes a powerful glintstone breath. The sorcerer Azure was an early sorcerer of the primeval current, but he wasn't the only one. There was also the sorcerer Lusat, who experienced a similar glintstone convergence of body and mind. Together, these masters of sorcery each glimpsed a part of the primeval current. And from what I gather, the primeval current seems like the sort of thing that can only really be glimpsed once before it either breaks or terrifies the viewer. Azure and Lusat only have one primeval current spell each, after all. For instance, when Lusat glimpsed into the primeval current, he conceived of the spell Stars of Ruin as he beheld the final moments of a great star cluster, and upon seeing it, he too was broken. And when Azure glimpsed into the primeval current, he saw darkness and conceived of the spell Comet Azure, but was left
don't
both
look at that
bewitched
shit then,
and
bro.
fearful of the abyss. Both Azure and Lusat clearly had a prominent role at the Academy, but Azure specifically was the first founding glintstone sorcerer to have an impact upon Raya Lucaria, for there is a line of research called the Carolus Conspectus, dubbed the oldest of the Academy's lineages of study,
that's the one we're making.
by the sorcerer Azure. Sorcerers who follow in his footsteps by studying this conspectus pursue the mysteries of comets, leading to new kinds of comet sorceries like glintstone comet shard and shard spiral. Each conspectus appears to be named after a founding individual. These stone crowns are designed after actual people, after all, people you can see in the flesh upon their matching portraits in the Academy. So even though the Carolus Conspectus follow the path began by the sorcerer Azure, their conspectus of learning must have been sort of formalized by someone named Carolus. But as time went on, more conspectuses needed to be created as new lines of inquiry were discovered, and so logically, the Olivinus Conspectus should have been the second to be created, for this line of research is also concerned with the study of meteors in the primeval current, except this conspectus began with the sorcerer Lusat. Their spells study clusters of stars, with lesser spells like glintstone stars and
right, so the other ones
shower,
study
all echoing the great
bodies
stars
of them, and then the other one
ruins
studies
that
the flow.
Originally broke Master Lusat. Lusat and Azure were true masters at the Academy, after all. They were actually dubbed Grandmasters, specifically, with special robes that reflected that, and it seems like no one ever went on to achieve such a rank or sacrifice as much as they did. And they sacrificed a lot. They can barely even move anymore, and when Selen talks about them, she talks about their bodies rather than a traditionally living person. perhaps they've actually ascended to
A
a
little
higher
bit too
plane of
much.
existence. That might explain why they weren't really around anymore to form their own conspectuses, something that was left to Corollas and Olivinus and others instead. Okay. With such enigmatic founders, many dedicated themselves to the study of glintstone, taking vows of virtue and austerity. In return, they received the deep blue robe of Raya Lucaria and were able to study on its grounds.
I mean, we're effectively
Some
replacing the
nobles of
upper lip
Leyndell were
with
even
a
permitted
beard.
to study here, clearly,
Moustache.
though their meager accomplishments never warranted them earning a stone crown, and fittingly, you only see them casting glintstone pebble in-game. To assist in their learning, a powerful spellcaster would often go and cast a spell called Terra Magica from the tallest belfry of the Academy. This sigil would be cast with such strength and allow for such a vivid experience of spellcasting success that it turned many a fledgling into a true sorcerer in a flash of understanding. But not all learning took place at the Academy. In fact, a couple of signature spells were specifically given to those who departed from the Academy to embark on journeys. Starlight is a spell that guides such sorcerers in dark places, and it reads, "Even during the blackest nights, sojourns underground, or imprisonment in jail, the stars are never far from a sorcerer's side." And then there was Glintstone Arc, which would allow these fledgling sorcerers to cleave through the ranks of the fools that would outnumber them on their journeys. Such journeys were encouraged by the Academy. There was even a conspectus for this practice called the Hierodus Conspectus, with a crown that was granted to scholars who engaged in nomadic study away from the Academy. In-game, this crown is worn by errant sorcerer Wilhelm, who fights with night sorceries and wields the Staff of Loss, which enhances night sorceries. This staff doesn't even have a glintstone embedded in its tip, and supposedly it can only cast night sorceries as a result. That's how important asceticism was to some sorcerers, and they believed that it was a powerful path towards discovery. This conspectus also seemed to see value in depriving the senses. The crown of Hierodus is blindfolded, after all. We see this same practice of veiling the eyes down in the Eternal City as well, and the Nox's descendants were of course accomplished practitioners of night sorceries, which seem to be thematically tied to this blindfolded, ascetic embrace of the void. Moving on though, this
It does
habit
seem that
of
way, but
sending
like
fledgling sorcerers away must have
it's
posed
also
a
like
bit of a problem, however,
a stealth
as
spell.
when war
Like
broke out
enemy
in the lands
NPCs
between,
can't dodge
Raya
it because they
Lucaria
can't
would
see it.
close and seal its gates, preventing access to most, including its journeying fledgling sorcerers. The only way to get back inside was to use a glintstone key to activate the warp magic within the seals. These keys only seem to belong to accomplished sorcerers, and they remember their users, meaning that thieves or bluntstones like Thops could not get inside. In the current age, Thops mentions that the Academy closed its gates after declaring that they wouldn't interfere with the shattering. Now, this suggests to me that the Academy might have had a bit of a habit of striving for a sort of neutrality or indifference in world affairs.
Well,
Indeed,
yeah, they're
they had
powerful.
developed an entire conspectus.
So obviously people are going to try to control them for war and shit.
These were
They're
the
like,
battle
nah,
mages
bro.
of the Heimer Conspectus, who wielded
We just
stone
wanna learn.
clubs and spells of cannon and gavel. A gavel is commonly used as a symbol of judgment, but rather than interfering with outside affairs, I believe the Heimer Conspectus mainly functioned as the Academy's judiciary. Their crown is even blindfolded, which is widely regarded in the real world as a symbol of unbiased justice. And with their preparedness for combat, the Heimer Conspectus were cited as being the only ones who dared to venture outside whenever war had broken out. And just like the blindfolded members of the Hierodus Conspectus, the battle mages of Heimer believed that seclusion was no way to foster discovery, and instead believed that it was only a convenient form of escape. That said, we do find sorcerers of other conspectuses outside the Academy as well, though you can sort of infer that they're a bit wary to be away from home because they're often accompanied by marionettes. The marionettes are dolls, constructs that were crafted and animated by the sorcerers who are their masters. There are a couple of variants. There's an avian variant with curved swords that can fly and throw fire pots. And then there's the typical marionettes with spiked spears, short swords, and short bows. Lots of short bows. These will commonly drop down upon you in ambush, and while they like to go a bit ballistic, they do act as crudely effective support for a ton of the sorcerers that you'll meet in-game. You'll even find a few of these down in the Raya Lucaria Crystal Tunnel, where glintstone miners are hard at work extracting glintstone and ore. These miners don't use conventional tools though. Instead, they mine with a digger's staff, embedded with a glintstone, casting spells such as Shatter Earth or Rock Blaster. A fascinating little detail here though is that these mining spells carried enormous stigma at the Academy because they marked their user as a failed scholar, perhaps as someone who had to turn to menial labor, lacking the intelligence to pursue the complex mysteries of the cosmos. Indeed, the Overseer's attack by crushing scraps of glintstone rather than with any advanced sorceries. At the end of the Crystal Tunnel is a Crystallian, an inorganic being that was hewn from crystal long ago. But these are more than mere constructs. They are ancient and even possess a faint sort of intellect dubbed the Wisdom of the Stone. Long ago, they even made a concord, or an agreement, with the Carrion royal family. We don't know the nature of this agreement, but some can be found chilling upon the Moonlight altar, allowed to stay in close proximity to their crystals, perhaps. And for their part, we do know that the Crystallians did teach the Carians a spell called Magic Downpour to mark the occasion. And Raya Lucaria sought kinship with these beings as well, for they are close to the ideals of the primeval current, and so are revered guests of the sorcerers. The best example of this might be down in the dimly lit Academy Crystal Cave underneath Raya Lucaria, a crystal cave that is not mined, perhaps out of respect for the Crystallian duo at the end of the tunnel. There are even living quarters down here, and I suspect these belong to a group of sorcerers called the Crystal Cadre, which was a group that was founded to research the wisdom of stone possessed by the Crystallian. However, just like the primeval current, these sorcerers clearly don't have all the answers on these beings. They call them inscrutable, and note that they have but one clear purpose, and that is to safeguard their crystals.
That is to kill me. Jeez.
So there is one theory on these beings, and
with their stupid little
they are waiting, yearning for the return of their creator, who will carve for them new brethren. A few sorcerers down here near the Crystallian are in possession of the Twin Sage Helm, which marks them as members of the Twin Sage Conspectus. These were the elites of the Academy, permitted to study and excel in sorceries of all kinds, and I assume it was these members, these elite members, who would climb out of this cave and cast the legendary Terra Magica that would cover the entire Academy's grounds from this tall belfry that we mentioned earlier. But the Twin Sage Helm wasn't the only mark of a proficient scholar. There was also the Witch's Glintstone Crown, which was granted to a scholar who excelled in her studies, which also merited the title of Witch. And again, you can see most of these Conspectus portraits hanging in Raya Lucaria. For example, here is the Witch, the Twin Sage, Carolus, Olivinus, and all of these portraits are hung in the debate parlor of the Academy, where members would likely have engaged in argument in order to test and help validate their ideas about sorcery. It's also where I assume they argued about whether certain things even should be allowed to be learned here, or whether certain members should be exiled, but we'll get to that shortly. Because first, the final conspectus that we haven't yet mentioned is the Lazuli Conspectus. These sorcerers studied lunar sorceries, a quote-unquote heterodox pursuit that views the moon as equal to the stars, with a robe coloured in the hue of the full moon, which signifies their heresy. And of course, these sorceries include many signature spells of Caria. And so we finally arrive at Caria. This is Carian Manor, and to the south are their stargazing grounds, both situated upon the western coast of Leonia, which, according to the map, has always been closely associated with Carian royalty. They have been around for a long time, a really long time. Specifically, Caria traces its roots all the way back to the ancient astrologers that existed alongside the fire giants. This is most apparent when you're looking at two items. First, the Sword of Night and Flame, which became a storied sword and treasure of Caria Manor. It was clearly crafted to commemorate the astrologers' early experiences with the primeval current and their shared experiences with the fire giants as well. And the fact that Caria inherited this sword suggests that they trace their ancestry back to the time of this sword. And then there's the Stargazer heirloom, which tells of the rise of Caria as a house of royalty through Renala and her full moon. The young astrologer gazed at the night sky as she walked. She had always chased the stars every step of her journey. Then she met the full moon, and in time, the astrologer became a queen. This royal house continued this tradition of stargazing and raised princesses and Carian knights to serve as their retainers. One of the foremost Carian knights was named Loretta, a woman we talked about recently in the video I did on the Eternal Cities, as it was rumored that she was an Albinauric. Albinaurics, as you may know if you watched that video, were widely despised in the Lands Between, though Caria is one of the few factions that seems to be pretty friendly with them. Albinauric sorcerers are found all throughout Caria Manor, and one, named Pidia, is literally called a Carian servant, linking the Eternal Cities with Caria in an alliance perhaps that might have allowed them to learn more about the stars from the Albinaurics. At any rate, Renala, with her full moon sorceries, was the champion of Caria, a prominent one too, apparently. And it's no surprise when you look at the powerful characteristics.
Just redo the
of her
whole
full
lower
moon.
half of the face.
It has immense gravity, and it eclipses all other magics. It lowers defenses. It is enchanting, and Renala used all of these traits to charm the Academy, to bewitch them, and become not just the Queen of Caria, but also the master of Raya Lucaria itself. And so, of course, here is her portrait, displayed most prominently in the Academy of Raya Lucaria, right next to what many assume is a portrait of Selen. For if you unmask her in-game, then she actually looks very similar to this witch, someone who was worthy of an entire conspectus and apparently was the most promising sorceress in the history.
It probably is her. I mean, she's got her own mask.
Even Selen, with all her promise, or perhaps because of her promise, would not be tolerated in the end.
If you recall, I was exiled from the Academy of Raya Lucaria. It was for attempting to restore the primeval current of Glintstone sorcery. The toothless pedantry peddled by the Carian royal family can rot for all I care. I want Glintstone sorceries that open our minds, unbound by terrestrial taboos.
For Selen to know so much about what she calls toothless pedantry peddled by the Carian royal family, I assume she was a part of the Academy during Renala's reign over it, and that it was Renala's influence that finally led to the Academy's intolerance of primeval current research. And Selen wasn't the only one expelled from the Academy. The Masters Azur and Lusat, two of the founding masters of Glintstone sorcery, were at some point driven from the Academy as well. And it's easy to see why. The primeval current is dangerous. Lusat's mind was broken after watching a star cluster break apart. Azur saw a darkness in the primeval current and was left fearful of its abyss. And imagine something so dangerous that just looking at it can damage your mind irreparably. In this way, the primeval current is almost Lovecraftian in its horror. We can't pin down the exact truth of why it terrifies, but we see its terrible effects on others and are left to wonder. What's more, this cosmic current is primeval. It's one of the first, if not the first thing to exist in the universe, and the fact that our cosmic origins might be terrifying really is kind of a bizarre and bewitching thought, right? I mean, I want to know what's in this current that's driving everybody insane, although I will mention again, we kind of know that at least creatures like Estelle are up there, and Estelle kind of is a signature, horrific, Lovecraftian monster, so yeah. At any
Indeed.
rate, Raya Lucaria was an institution now, with power and influence in the lands between, and with these things, naturally, there would have come a need for self-preservation. And the biggest threat at this stage wouldn't have been external, it would have been internal. The biggest threat was probing the primeval current too deeply. And so, while primeval current research seems to still be okay as long as it's under the Carolus or Olivinus conspectus, a line was drawn, and the masters Azure and Lusat were eventually driven from the academy, as was Selen the Witch. When we first meet her, Selen states that glintstone sorcery is rooted in the study of the stars, and she laments that most sorcerers have forgotten that fact. She resents that the sorcerers took their power and then sort of turned a blind eye to deeper research in order to protect themselves. And
they're a bunch of
it's
bitches.
kind of easy to empathize with her and to see her as this underdog fighting for the truth against an enormous institution. Even Thops thinks she's a good person in the end, but can you really blame Raya Lucaria for taking a stand when you see this? This is a school of graven mages, a mass of sorcerers fused together so that they might be fashioned into the seeds of stars. As the lore goes, this was apparently a valid line of research into the primeval current, and that in the name of this research, fellow sorcerers should be collected and fused together in a cluster to, I guess, create a star made of life. These creations were considered the nightmare of the Academy, and rightfully so.
Maybe that's why the
They
stone
represented
has
Selen's
knowledge.
Complete loyalty to the truth, no
Or
matter
whatever the
cost
wisdom of the
to her
stone.
fellow man. Naturally, such a thing had to be forbidden. But then, you have to empathize with Selen a little bit and agree that it is a bit ironic that the exact line of inquiry that gave rise to the Academy was the very thing that posed a threat to its existence in the end. Eventually, the Academy would seek to rid itself of Caria's influence, but the Carian royal family had long prepared for the disloyalty of the Academy. There's a reason why the Carian Knight's shields are extremely magic resistant. There's a reason why there are many spells based on a policy of Carian retaliation, where magic can be absorbed and then turned back against its caster. There's a reason why their knights were specifically sworn to the moon, not the stars. Renala, as a proficient astrologer, might have even foreseen the eventual disloyalty of the Academy.
It's true.
Although that's just speculation on my part. But before that, there was another war that would come first. A war against the Champions of Gold, which Caria was extremely prepared to face as well. The Order of the Erd Tree had conquered fire giants, the Storm Lords, and Caria and the Academy were next, it seems. Led by Radagon, who we now know was a part of Marika, a great war began. But here, the Order of the Erd Tree actually met their match. Despite numbering fewer than 20, the Carian Knights were a match for even the Champions of Gold in battle, and enchanted troll knights fought on Caria's side as well, called into service from an ancient oath made with Renala, back in her youth atop the mountaintops of the giants. And so, instead of weathering a stalemate, a truce was proposed between the two parties, and sealed in holy matrimony.
Radagon once cleansed himself with celestial dew, repented his territorial aggressions, and swore his love to Renala. The Order of the Erd Tree and the fate of the moon were conjoined, and all the wounds of war forgiven.
And then he gave her an egg.
Of course, we
that
all
now
know
she's
that
obsessed
Radagon
with.
is Marika, but no one else did. And so secrecy was of the utmost importance to Radagon, and he imposed this need upon his newly acquired vassals. These are the Carian preceptors, essentially professors of sorcery who serve the Carian royals. They wear these blue robes embroidered with cosmic designs, which is a reference to Caria's astrological heritage, surely. But when Radagon married Renala, he ordered the Carian preceptors to wear an additional piece of attire, a mask with the mouth sewn shut with gold thread in that signature crisscross pattern that is emblematic of Radagon, to make it clear that all their matters were to be kept strictly private. For of course, Radagon was hiding something, that
Of course.
might be able to be seen if anyone looked at him too closely. Indeed, this desire for secrecy was well founded, for someone did look at him too closely during this time. A sculptor who secretly rendered this dichotomy between Radagon and Marika into his work. But no one else discovered Marika Radagon's secret, not until we came along. And long before that, Radagon would leave Rennala, and her heart would go along with him. And it was then that those at the Academy realized that Rennala was no champion, after all.
Indeed.
When we see her, we realize that she was likely left quite witless and innate after this loss of Radagon, and so it was no surprise that the Academy took this chance to rebel against the Carrion Royals. With Rennala essentially held hostage and safely locked in their grand library, the Academy went to war with Caria, focusing their assault upon Caria Manor, for that is where a siege commemorated by this graveyard of swords took place. The enchanted soldiers who fought
now
on
this is
behalf
where we
of the
need to stuff
Academy
that paper
were
back
named
in.
the Knights of the Cuckoo, wearing red and blue surcoats that depict their namesake and carrying shields that boasted high magic damage negation. They were explicitly purposed as mage hunters and have been quoted as stating, "Our enemy is none other than Caria itself." They also throw Albinoric pots, which reference the torture of Albinorics and the hatred of Albinorics that the Cuckoos have. And again, the Albinorics are found throughout all Caria, so these Knights of the Cuckoo were fighting against some true enemies here. But despite some of their descriptions saying that the Cuckoo Knights were sworn to the Academy, I think that's actually just wishful thinking by Raya Lucaria. The Scholar's armament and shield spells, for example, were actually spells that were quote-unquote taught to the Knights of the Cuckoo as payment for their contract. So they were getting paid to fight, and learning these low intellect spells suited them because they were not proficient sorcerers.
Alrighty.
For example, instead of casting spells, they would crush broken clumps of glintstone, dubbed faux sorceries or fake sorceries by the Academy. But
they
most
are
telling
fake.
about their loyalty is the Cuckoo Knight armor, which says, "Its left breast is emblazoned with a peering cuckoo, whence came their name," which straight up admits that perhaps the bird's shrewd gaze is an expression of their refusal to be mere servants of the Academy. And in the end, the Knights of the Cuckoo failed pretty hard. They were not only defeated in the siege of Caria Manor, but they were turned into puppets there, and many now fight on Caria's behalf. We get an idea of how much they must resent this when they somehow break free and confront Pidia, a Carian, an Albinoric, and a mage. 3 things that they absolutely hate. But unfortunately, guys, that's where I have to leave things for now. There's an entire summary I also wanted to do about Celia, the town of sorcery, as well, but honestly, I feel like Celia is very difficult to speculate on and puzzle out, so considering how long that would take to put into words, I think it might have to wait until another video. But please subscribe, because I will talk about it eventually, and I think I'll also give Selen her own Prepare to Cry episode as well. Hers is going to be amazing. There's some good things ahead, as always. Special thanks to Quelag for reviewing the script, and of course to MissPap1, who did all of the incredible visuals in this video. He's a true master, and I'm lucky to be working with him. But I'll see you in the next one, guys. Thank you for watching. Her affliction. It seems like this objectively good deed, which is a rare sight in Elden Ring, especially for a demigod whose strengths have been known, who has been captured but is unresponsive for now. And after watching this video, I think you'll agree that Miquella is a topic that almost has to be explored further in some upcoming DLC. For how could they not be? Their character is surely too major, too foreshadowed, and too intriguing to just ignore.
Indeed.
So, let's learn everything that there is to know. For starters, Miquella is the demigod child of Queen Marika and King Consort Radagon, who, as I'm sure you're well aware at this point, are the same being. You can learn more about the timeline of events from my other videos, but basically, after Radagon left Rennala, the Academy told Radagon to go fuck himself, basically, but Radagon took that literally, and he sired a third set of demigod children all on his own, who were the twins Miquella and Melania. These children appear to be represented by the butterfly items in the game, and
Classic.
the nascent butterfly
Giga Chad.
appears to represent Miquella. Its description elaborates on his state of eternal childhood, stating that it appears as if it's just emerged from its cocoon for its entire life. Indeed, the word nascent means that something is just coming into existence,
and it got myself
beginning
pregnant
to display signs of future potential. And that nascence is eternal.
And then my children were fucking demigods.
Eternal nascence is incredibly important for his character. For Miquella and Melania both seem to occupy different sides of the life and death cycle. That's not to say that Miquella represents life and Melania represents death. Rather, it seems like both land somewhere in the middle of each process. Melania is constantly resisting her scarlet rot and is in this perpetual state of dying, and Miquella is in this constant state of nascence. He is newly born and showing an abundance of life and burgeoning potential. Special thanks to Quailag for making this clear to me. So Miquella is nascent, but he's also abundant, and I think that's another extremely key word for him. For example, there's this cut weapon called the Abundance and Decay Twin Blade, which symbolizes the twins and suggests that the twins were born from an inseparable fate and hold the runes of both abundance and decay between them. Not to mention, the word abundance is also literally spoken by Miquella in his cut content. And thanks to a very recent discovery by Sekiro Dubi, we know this cut dialogue.
This guy needs to stop talking about cut content bullshit.
And here
it might be
he appears
cut
to be
because
leading
it's
you
not
towards a
canon
unique
anymore,
ending
you know?
for the game, and he talks about his ability to make life flourish, stating, "This is for thee, mine abundance, my drop of dew. Quench thy thirst throughout thy frame, blossom and burgeon, time and again, grow larger, stronger, until the day cometh, when thou canst share in my dream. Elden Ring, O Elden Ring, beget order most elegant from my tender reverie." And before I go on, I do want to say that Miquella talking about his abundance is cut content, and you shouldn't really take it as canon, but I think it does give us a deeper look at not only the powers that Miquella might have had, but also the world that he could create. He goes on to say, "If thou covetest the throne, impress my vision upon thine heart. In the new world of thy making, all things will flourish, whether graceful or malign." And I love that final line. All things will flourish, whether graceful or malign, because Miquella isn't enforcing any real notions of good or evil here. Instead, in the new world of his making, he simply wants all things to flourish, and I feel like that is a very unique viewpoint for a character in a Souls game. Not to mention, Miquella is certainly
usually everything wants everything to die.
That is capable of creating this new world,
especially the god type figures.
He is
like,
one of
just
the very
me,
few
just me,
chosen
and my
by the
children
Two Fingers to succeed Queen Marika and become a god, to usher in a new age. Now we could go into an entire debate about why the twins are valid Empyreans and why they were born afflicted, but honestly that could almost be an entire video of its own, so for now I'll just give the simple answer, which is that these twins were probably valid Empyreans because they have singular parentage from a god, but that this singular parentage was probably also responsible for their afflictions as well, due to the almost incestual implications of such a thing. Why do I feel like it was George R.R. Martin that wrote this part? Anyway, let's move into the early childhood years of Miquella's eternal childhood. Miquella's early years were clearly quite inspired by their father, Radagon, who fostered a bit of a fundamentalist streak in his prodigal son, and Miquella would go on to invent fundamentalist incantations of his own, dubbed Discus of Light and Triple Rings of Light, which he gave as gifts to his father. These gifts reveal that Radagon and Miquella had a good relationship, and Radagon must have been proud of his son because these two spells do represent those two key fundamentals of the Golden Order, namely that there is a law of causality, which is a branching cause and effect that goes outwards, but also that there is a law of regression, that all things yearn eternally to converge once again. And in gratitude, Radagon countered with a gift of his own, showing Miquella Radagon's Rings of Light. These incantations would go on to become core fundamentalist spells, as they are true to those two concepts that form the basis of the Golden Order. But there is another aspect of Golden Order fundamentalism, and that is the persecution of those who live in death. Hunters of these undead would attempt to stamp them out with spells such as Order's Blade and Litany of Proper Death, which deal additional damage against those who live in death and prevent them from resurrecting. To recap, those who live in death exist because of Godwyn the Golden, who was one of the early sons of Marika and Godfrey, who was eventually killed with a fragment of the Rune of Death, and then the Rune of Death would eventually spread its undeath throughout the lands between via Deathroot. And there is an entire debate that we could have here about whether the persecution of those who live in death is even true to the core principles of fundamentalism. Goldmask certainly doesn't seem to think so. In fact, according to the Order healing spell, Goldmask laments the hunters of those who live in death, deeming them to be fanatics, who wanted nothing more than an absolute evil to contend with. And the reason I bring up this debate at all is because you could argue that Miquella was on the side of these fanatic hunters, as he created multiple weapons that were capable of effectively slaying those who live in death. For example, this is Golden Epitaph, and it is a sword that was made to commemorate the death of Godwyn the Golden, first of the demigods to die. It is infused with the humble prayer of a young boy and reads, "O brother, Lord brother, please die a true death." So this weapon is an effective tool of killing those who live in death permanently, and clearly the young boy who created it was Miquella. We can infer this because the sigil that appears when you use
the Halig Tree
skill is the Halig Tree sigil, and once activated, this ability, called Last Rites, imbues the sword with a holy power that prevents those who live in death from reviving. But beyond this being a potential tool to slay those who live in death, is that this weapon points towards an early kinship between Miquella and Godwyn, a relationship that might have made it all the more painful when Godwyn's soul would perish, but his body would remain, spawning Deathroot. This is interesting, as it gives Miquella a legitimate emotional grievance against those who live in death. And it's almost a bit hypocritical, I think, for what I believe to be Miquella's character, as we previously established that he might have been this character who wants all life to flourish, but I guess that principle might not extend to those who live in death for him. This sword might not be the only representation of Miquella's relationship with Godwyn. That relationship is potentially strengthened even more when we consider this statue found in Elfale before the Halig Tree. It depicts a larger figure who is clearly embracing the two Empyrean twins, Miquella and Melania, but then who is this larger figure? It could be their parent, Marika or Radagon, but then it doesn't have their signature hair braid, and instead it has this long, wavy hair. What's more,
does
the
have a weird
statue
hair.
asset is flat-chested, which appears to rule out Marika, at least. And after reading a good amount of debate online about this, I think it's a fair conclusion to say that this statue represents Godwyn, who himself does seem to have long, wavy hair. And this statue being enshrined here really tells a story. It's a story of two gifted but afflicted siblings who were supported by their older brother, but then they were left alone, as their older brother would become the first demigod to die. And this isn't the only statue in this location. Far more prominent in the area are these statues, which depict two siblings left alone after their brother died. There was one sibling, Miquella, who was forced to remain as a young child, and another who grew up in great pain, eventually losing vision and limbs to rot and decay. These statues are everywhere in the Halig Tree, and they tell that sorrowful story. They are an early sign of Miquella's extreme empathy for his sister, and they foreshadow his desperate attempts to give her relief from her terrifying condition. and so the young Mikola abandoned fundamentalism, for it could do nothing to treat Melania's accursed rot. This was the beginning of unalloyed gold. So, what is unalloyed gold? Well, an alloy is something that's created when you combine metals, usually because you want to create a stronger compound at the expense of its purity. So, if we were to view Marika's Golden Order as if it were a metal, which I think is something that the lore wants you to do considering the implications of the tarnished and everything like that, then Marika's Golden Order
it's
would
like a metal
definitely be an alloyed
beam.
metal. Just think of all the foreign powers that
Black
it's
metal.
absorbed in the interest of strength. For example, Godfrey and his Crucible Knights were enlisted to devastate Marika's enemies. The ancient dragons were won over and eventually became a part of Laendel's forces. Even the House of the Erdtree and the Moon were married at one point. Literally. After all, as Muriel puts it, all things can be conjoined under the Golden Order, so I think Marika was definitely open to fusing factions and ideologies to an extent, as long as it made her treasured Golden Order alloy stronger. So hopefully now you understand what I mean when I say that Mikola's gold is unalloyed. It is pure, it is untainted, and it is, perhaps, a singular ideology. And if you subscribe to the idea that the cut content is still representative of Mikola, then I would say that his ideology is what I had Mikola quote earlier, that in his new world, all things should be allowed to flourish, whether graceful or malign, and that is his pure ideology. Though, of course, that is my speculation based on cut content as well.
Of course,
so
if he
please
truly
keep that in
believes
mind.
that, then
But Mikola's unalloyed
why are
gold
his dudes
couldn't
out
have
there
just
murdering
been
shit?
this metaphysical concept of pure ideology. It was a physical material as well. For example, this is an unalloyed gold water lily, said to have been beloved by Mikola. This is a bewitching branch, blessed with an incantation of unalloyed gold. Unalloyed gold decorated the armor and shields of his soldiers, it was inserted into their weapons, and, most importantly, perhaps, it was forged into a set of armor for his sister, Melania. Because, remember, the whole reason Mikola embraced unalloyed gold in the first place, it seems, was because he thought that it could treat his sister's accursed rot,
He's a
while
moron.
fundamentalism could not. And he was right, for Melania's scarlet rot is no mere disease. It's literally the divine essence of an outer god, and Melania is
Well,
its
if he was
vessel
right, then why didn't it
that will
fucking
one
work?
day bloom into a true goddess. But unalloyed gold is one of the few materials in the game that can ward away such meddling of the outer gods. Another example are the mirror helms, like the one that Iji wears, which literally reflects the influence of the outer gods. And personally, I think the reason that unalloyed gold inhibits the meddling of the outer gods is because it is a pure metal and potentially a pure ideology. But if that's not enough reason for you, then Quelaag actually has a great video where she breaks down potential reasons at a chemical level. But at any rate, reasons aside, Mikola crafted needles of unalloyed gold, which could be inserted into the tortured flesh of one afflicted by rot to alleviate their suffering and forestall the effects of the rot. And true to the needle's descriptions, the outer god of rot isn't the only one affected by this. Our character actually uses the final version of this unalloyed gold needle to subdue the outer god of frenzy, which is something you might want if you decided to be a terrible person and burn down the world. Anyway, when we first find Mikola's needle, it's been broken, snapped in half, and picked up by a commander at the very center of the Scarlet Swamp. But once this needle has been prepared, we can give the golden needle to Millicent, proving that it does indeed work to forestall the rotting sickness, to remove pain and nightmares from the afflicted. It is, after all, lovingly crafted by Mikola himself.
Well, well, this is a marvel indeed. The work of a true artisan, a meticulous, bold craftsman who grasps the essence of life.
In crafting these needles and pursuing unalloyed gold, Mikola is attempting to save his sister from her affliction, It seems like this objectively good deed, which is a rare sight in Elden Ring, especially for a demigod whose strengths have been known to tip them towards madness, and that is what makes Miquella such a pure and likable character in Elden Ring. So it's no wonder really that Melania venerated her brother. She is a character of undefeated prowess, and she's an Empyrean, no
She's
less.
never known defeat.
And yet she dedicated her blade to Miquella, and Miquella alone, for she believes that he possesses the wisdom.
Yeah, make it this guy on the bottom.
Bond and duty to one another is legendary, and that's something that becomes quite clear when we explore Miquella's Halig tree and see these statues depicting their embrace all around. And if you were one of the many defiled outcasts,
Sort of. I mean, I have no idea what the fuck I'm doing.
Inspired by this story, and you might
This is
have
only
felt
my third
inclined
time
to
playing with clay.
earn Miquella's favor and make the long pilgrimage towards your salvation, towards the distant divine Halig.
Looks more like fucking Lemmy.
Embrace that was Miquella's.
Look at this shit.
The Ace of Spades! Ace of Spades! What even is the Halig tree? Well, it's pretty obvious that it's a sort of Erd tree. For one, Erd tree avatars have clearly emerged from it, which they only do in order to protect the Erd tree's own offspring. And then there's the Halig tree knight armor, which confirms that the Halig tree ultimately failed to grow into an Erd tree. And one thing I've been wondering is, when exactly was the Halig tree planted then? If we knew when, then we might be able to guess at its purpose. Was it planted before or after the shattering of the Elden Ring? Because when the Elden Ring was shattered, golden seeds flew from the Erd tree, scattering across the various lands as if life itself knew that its end had come. These seeds create these little illusory trees and likely spawned the minor Erd trees as well, so I think it's a fair assumption that Miquella might have planted the Halig tree from an Erd tree seed. And if that was indeed the case, then it should have happened after the shattering, for before that, the Erd tree was considered perfect and eternal, and it wasn't even believed that Erd tree seeds could exist. But on the flip side, the golden epitaph sword that we mentioned earlier likely existed before the shattering, as it was created to commemorate Godwyn's death, and this sword displays the Halig tree sigil when its weapon art is activated, so one could infer that the Halig tree must have existed at this point too, right? So I guess it's always possible that Miquella somehow procured an Erd tree seed before the shattering, or simply grew it from his own being, as he is a scion of the Golden Bough after all. But whatever the case, Miquella clearly decided that growing such a tree was important, and he even went so far
Yeah, he's
as
definitely
to
some sort of
water it
fucking weird
with his
alien.
own blood. This confirms that the Erd tree is indeed a blood-sucking parasite. Just kidding. Sort of.
It is,
you have
though.
to admit, it is pretty disturbing that an Erd tree could flourish in such a manner. But this does lead us to the final question, which is, why was the Halig tree planted? What was the point of it? And at the end of the day, the main reason is always going to be because it's like the Erd tree. It's natural to compare them, and the item descriptions seem to want you to compare them as well. The Erd tree is this enormous icon of power and faith in the lands between, so evoking that and inspiring worship is clearly a valuable thing. But the Erd tree was only really an icon of
This
faith
fucking
in its later
mustache is
years.
giving me
Before
issues.
that, it was a symbol of abundance, with light as warm as the gentle sun that could gradually heal all those who bathed in its
How the
rays.
fuck?
But perhaps most importantly,
How do
during
you
this
sculpt
time
a
of abundance,
mustache?
it would drip
What?
sacred dew, sap,
How does it
or
even fucking
tears
work?
that could bestow blessings, form crystal
Need like a
tears,
toothpick,
and
I
even
think?
be embedded into talismans. These
And
were
just, like-
treasured things, and naturally, this was an extremely
I have no
valuable
idea.
symbol for Miquella to
I
evoke,
have no idea.
since he is himself associated with dew and abundance in the cut content. And his Halig tree did drip with dew. The greenish amber of the Halig tree can even be seen in cut content items. It even looks as if it's mingled with a bit of Miquella's own blood. And
I
that
think we're going to
signature
get a lot
green
more of
hue
those cut
Halig tree
items, the
amber,
Halig tree
is also
items
seen
in the DLC.
Halig tree knight sword, which is not a cut weapon, and this was modeled after the Carrion Knight's own swords, except it was embedded with amber from the Halig tree.
Since obviously
instead
Miquella is
of
going to
brimstone.
be
Okay, so the Halig tree is a
more
great
prominent
symbol
in
of
that
faith
one.
and power and abundance.
Maybe they finally
and
wake up.
Miquella is related to abundance.
I mean,
in the
they're
cut
sitting there
content,
on torrent.
but
in
what else
that
does the Halig
image.
tree add in terms of
We
value?
got
Well, the Halig tree itself is something of a vessel, fit for a god. Mikola plants himself inside it later on. Melania returns home to it, and speaking of it being a home, many other creatures have made their home within the tree, and within the brace that supports it as well. And I guess you could also argue that the Halig tree might be a sort of a tool to be used. After all, Marika puts the Erd tree to use in such a way, using its roots to absorb people after their death, and perhaps even its branches to rebirth life. And then the Erd tree is later used as a prison, with thorns that are almost entirely impenetrable. But I don't think Mikola planned to use the Halig tree in such a way. Perhaps the biggest difference between the Halig tree and the Erd tree is that the Halig tree was built in a largely inhospitable region. It is extremely difficult to reach, and unlike the Erd tree, it might not really be designed for the benefit of the vast majority of the world. As
yeah, it might
stands,
just be
the
for
Halig
Mikola
tree strikes
or
me as
Melania.
being more like the painted world from Dark Souls. It's a place for the outcasts, the heretical, and the malign, not to mention the low and the meek, who are specifically named in the description of the Sacred Crown Helm. While many of the Scarlet Rot Afflicted seem to be here because of the eventual decay of the Halig tree, I think that there are a number of refugees here that would have been here before that, namely the Misbegotten, the Crystallian, these astray mages of Raya Lucaria, and of course Loretta, who deemed this place to be a great haven for the despised Albinaurics. The second generation Albinaurics even carry a weapon called the Ivory Sickle, which reads, "These weapons are evidence of their dedication to the Halig tree, despite never having entered its presence." And we really don't find a single Albinauric within the Halig tree. I'll admit, I do find this a bit strange. You do find quite a few Albinaurics so close to the Halig tree. It's a bit strange to me they don't go just that little bit further. The reason given for the first generation of Albinaurics not being at the Halig tree is given by Albus, who says that their faded legs are the reason for that. But yeah, we find them defending Mikola and his Halig tree all the same.
Yeah,
at
later.
The Ordina liturgical
Those are the second
town,
gen
which takes us
Albinaurics,
to the
though.
Halig tree via a puzzle within an Everjail. The word liturgical means relating to public worship, and this town is fittingly filled with many statues of Mikola sitting alone, cradling what might have become the Halig tree back when it was still just a sapling. I also find it interesting that the Halig tree is never called out as competing with the Erd tree, or never called out for housing all these undesirables. Perhaps the House of the Erd tree was happy to see ungraceful folk leave their lands. Perhaps the Halig tree was extremely well hidden from everyone and they didn't know. Or perhaps Mikola could just get away with it because he was beloved
Mikola,
by all.
you fucking demigod, what are you gonna do about it,
is an
bitch?
item that you can create from Mikola's lilies, and it is blessed with an incantation of unalloyed gold and reads, "The Empyrean Mikola is loved by many people. Indeed, he has learned very well how to compel such affection." And that second part that says he has learned how to compel affection, to me that's saying that Mikola is very good at knowing how to inspire others' affection to his own advantage. And nowhere is this more clear, I think, than at Castle Sol. This is the Halig Tree Secret Medallion. It's furnished with that signature green amber, and it features the Halig Tree in the background, for it allows you to access a secret lower level of the Grand Lift of Rold and progress through the consecrated snowfields to this sacred place. Having both halves of this secret medallion is therefore extremely desirable, for the medallion has another name. It's called Mikola's Favor.
Mikola's favor can be
Mikola's favor.
Slaughter, slaughter, slaughter. The all-hearing slaughtered. But alas, it was for naught. But all you need do is snatch it from the big pot.
Gideon is
All
the
you need to do
all-hearing
is watch it on the
in this dialogue,
Jumbotron.
and he slaughtered an entire village just for one half of this medallion, but he did not find it in Albus's possession. but you can. And the other half is at Castle Sol.
I think it's too gooey right now.
Before a nameless phantom.
Trying to get a nice flat shape here,
Lord
but it
Mikola,
keeps
forgive
mushing.
Me. The sun has not been swallowed. Our prayers were lacking. Your comrade remains soulless. I will never set my eyes upon it now. Your divine Halig tree. So, this phantom seemingly has, or I guess had, one half of the medallion, and yet he laments that he will now never set eyes upon the Halig tree. To me, this suggests that Mikola might have been withholding the second half of the medallion from him, or that this phantom believed that he could solicit the second half of the medallion from Mikola and make it to the Halig tree if he achieved his goal here at Castle Sol and basically earned Mikola's favor. But what exactly was supposed to happen?
He's a fucking idiot.
Sol? What does it mean when the phantom says, "The sun has not been swallowed, our prayers were lacking, your comrade remains soulless"? It means, I think, that the residents of Castle Sol and Mikola were attempting to restore the dead soul of Godwyn the Golden. And just to refresh your memory, when a fragment of the Rune of Death was used to kill Godwyn, it was also being used at the exact same time to kill Ranni, and since they perished at the same time, Ranni lost her body, and Mikola's demigod brother, Godwyn, perished in Sol alone. And despite this death seeming so final, Mikola clearly believes that some sort of ritual performed here could restore the soul of his comrade. For example, here's some more dialogue from a different phantom that reads, "O great sun, frigid sun of Sol, surrender yourself to the eclipse, grant life to the soulless bones." But the question is, how does that work? How does an eclipse restore life to Godwyn? Now, you can just take Mikola at face value and trust that he knows what he's doing, or we can try to learn as much as we can about the eclipse and see if we can reason out the mechanism behind this process. So at Castle Sol, we find the Eclipse Shotel, which reads, "Storied sword and treasure of Castle Sol that depicts an eclipsed sun drained of color. In Sol, the sight of an eclipse inspires a dreadful awe, preventing an onlooker from averting his gaze." The most important part of this description, though, is the part that says it's the storied sword of Castle Sol, as this proves that the veneration of the eclipse here goes back a long way. But what does an eclipse represent? So, according to the Eclipse Crest shields, the eclipsed sun, drained of color, is the protective star of soulless demigods. Honestly, I think calling it a protective star is kind of the closest we come to understanding the mechanism here, because you could reason that a protective star might be a sort of outer god that lends them power, though that is just speculation. The description goes on to say that the sun in eclipse is said to be the symbol of the wandering mausoleum where the soulless demigods slumber. So note that it says demigods plural here.
Yeah,
now,
soulless demigods.
The wandering mausoleums come to house many demigods from a gameplay point of view, because you can take their remembrances here. But it could be a word that is slightly lost in translation, as the Japanese version of the word demigods does not
take the remembrances. What you do is you take remembrances you've already got. So basically, you have souls.
I think the wandering mausoleums
duplicate them here.
When Godwyn died, I think that the mausoleum was intended to be a resting place for him initially, but then also for any future demigods, as all of a sudden, all of their true deaths had become possible as well, with the theft of a fragment of the Rune of Death. The mausoleum knights themselves are these headless soldiers who behead themselves, willingly following their master into death. As such, they become these headless spirits, tied to the land so that they might better defend the walking mausoleums. They also carry eclipse-crested shields, and the eclipse is said to aid the mausoleum knights by keeping destined death at bay. It is their symbol, and by keeping destined death at bay, maybe it's helping to keep their souls tied to the land. We could speculate for a long time on how the eclipse has this power, and I've done my best. Maybe other people have a better take on it, and maybe you guys do in the comments, but in the end, it's simpler just to trust that Mikola knew what he was doing with the eclipse at Castle Sol, where he wanted to block out the sun and restore Godwyn's soul. All that said, we can't trust him too much, I guess, because it's important to remember that this ritual failed. According to this phantom, the sun was not swallowed. I guess the protective star of the soulless demigods did not listen to their prayers, and it did not. But It is really fascinating to learn that such a thing might even be
Radon
possible.
stopped the stars though, so maybe
Godwyn,
that
whose soul seems to be
was
as
like at
dead
the same
as
time.
Rani's body might actually not be. So if his soul is somewhere, then where has it fled to? A part of me wonders, if his soul is lost, then maybe it's lost within a dream. One theory I did come up with regarding the mechanism by which Godwyn's soul is brought back by the eclipse is that his soul might be brought back by bringing about a sort of artificial dusk with the eclipse. That's because those who live in death are called the Duskborn, after all, so there is an association between night and death, to be sure. And there's also an association between death and sleep. For example, when you pursue Fia's questline, you use her as a medium to enter Godwyn's deathbed dream, which is an entire dreamscape where the dragon Fortisax is futilely fighting against the death in his companion. And then there's Roger, who speaks this line of dialogue as he is on the precipice of succumbing to Deathroot.
Maybe I should tell you. Lately, I feel I'm on the precipice of falling into a deep, fathomless slumber.
He does say he's about to fall into sleep. So, in conclusion,
it says
the
a
realm
deep,
of death
fathomless
does seem
slumber.
accessible through dream. And I think this is the perfect time to mention that Miquella has an alter ego. Some say she is a comely young girl.
Saint Trina.
Others are sure he is a boy. This is where we have to talk about the enigmatic figure named Saint Trina. Perhaps the biggest in-game clue about Saint Trina's true identity is Trina's lily, which bears this undeniable resemblance to Miquella's lily of unalloyed gold. Its description reveals that it is a symbol of faith in Saint Trina, dulls the senses, preventing agitation. Naturally, it can be used to craft a bunch of sleep-afflicting items like Saint Trina's arrow, which states that the sweet oblivion of sleep can become quite the habit.
And who's asleep?
It tells of the priests
Miquella.
of Saint Trina who use these arrows to spread their teachings, though the Japanese description seems to specify that these were more of a tool used for their rituals. So it's largely left to your imagination as to what rituals these priests might have been performing, though I will mention that it seems Saint Trina might actually be able to be found somewhere within sleep. This is suggested by Feather's cookbook, which reads, a record of crafting techniques left by a man who was utterly captivated by Saint Trina. He continued the search for her in his slumber. We get a side profile of her in the hilt of Saint Trina's sword, which hints at that flowing astray hair that she has, and then we get a much better front-on view of this feminine adult form upon Saint Trina's torch. The carvings depict Saint Trina, but in adult form, somewhat unnervingly. The carving is indeed unnerving, and it's certainly strange considering Miquella is supposed to be eternally a child. It raises the question, what has to happen for Miquella to grow up into this? And why is this bizarre creature the adult form that he takes? Another question worth asking, I think, is whether Miquella even has total control of Saint Trina. What if he's in a similar situation to Marika Radigan, where their alter ego is an opposite of sorts, and able to act almost as if they have their own free will? So all of this is definitely a little bit of a disturbing view of what Saint Trina could be, but I guess we do have cut content that does somewhat reassure me that their alter ego is still a benevolent person. This cut content was first showcased by Sekido Dubi, and this cut content is truly ancient. It exists in one of the oldest versions of the game that we know about, so a lot has probably changed since then, but regardless,
like the canonness
here we
of
can
it.
learn about Saint Trina's crystal ball, which once read, a crystal ball full of mist, symbol of Saint Trina of the Cradle Song, copies dream mist from a sleeping being. Dream mist was once used as an ingredient in rare and potent physics. May the quietude of slumber come to all and sundry, even to those whose red eyes burn with the flames of frenzy. So this reveals that this cut version of Saint Trina even once had sympathy for those afflicted by the flame of frenzy. They even went so far as to teach the merchants their songs.
Our song derives from an old lullaby, sung for us long ago, deep inside our tomb. whoever it was.
Oh, wait, right down the center, there's a huge one. Okay, so 1, 2, 3. Okay, perfect. We're good.
The description of Miquella's songs as a lullaby is referenced by the modern-day sleep pot description, which reads, like a lullaby or a quagmire, its light purple haze irresistibly draws its victims down into sleep. Sweet dreams. This is the closest thing we have to Dream Mist as well, which was an item that you could again once collect from sleeping enemies. And after you did this, you were supposed to sell this Dream Mist to the merchants, who used it to quell their flame of frenzy.
Interesting.
As the merchants once said, whoever it was that sings, now sings no longer. And this is a detail that has remained intact even in the final version of Elden Ring, with St. Trina's sword stating that St. Trina's appearance was as sudden as their disappearance. Something clearly happened to Miquella that prevented them from continuing their work as St. Trina, and that is what we will discuss next. At some point, Miquella embedded himself into the Halig tree. Why he did this is never explicitly stated, but I think we can make a good attempt at puzzling it out. So, Miquella famously watered the Halig tree with his own blood, since it was a sapling, so I guess you could argue that he embedded himself in it to simply feed the tree more, which I guess is possible because the tree does eventually
looks
wither
like fucking Sneak
without
King.
Miquella inside it, and Gideon seems to tie his removal with the death of the Halig tree, or it turning into a husk, but I don't think that can be the only reason why he embedded himself. For instance, look closely at the Halig tree roots, and you'll see the form of a tree-like woman, and where her womb should be, there's a gap. A gap that once contained Miquella's cocoon cradled by the Halig tree.
Indeed,
Now,
but
either
fucking
Miquella
Moog
was
stole
attempting
that
to
shit, that
fuse
creepy
into and
bastard.
become this woman-like figure who might even be the adult form shown on St. Trina's torch, or there was a rebirth occurring here. This is a cocoon within a womb, after all, so rebirth could have been the intent here, but regardless, it seems things ended prematurely.
Cocoon within a
for
womb,
Miquella would
indeed.
eventually be ripped out of the womb, and the
Weird.
Halig tree would split and decay. And so, when we arrive at the Halig tree and the town of Elfale that is built into the brace that supports it, the music here hits extremely hard. This place is just so sorrowful, for the Halig tree and Miquella's lilies and even St. Trina's lilies are all wilting, and all who live here are just hoping and praying for their lord to return. I love the little detail of the guards looking outwards and sitting dejectedly. To make matters worse for them, it was here that they realized that the sacred light inside them would explode upon their imminent deaths, and yet, in spite of this, their spirit ashes show their faith and state, "May the flash of our deaths guide Miquella's return." And
Indeed.
Malenia is here too, holding to the husk of Miquella, dreaming and waiting for Miquella to return, and believing full well that he will.
Corpse after corpse left in my wake as I awaited his return.
Malenia's set reveals that she believes her brother will keep his promise. So what was that promise, I wonder? Was it merely to return, or was it something more? How much does Malenia know? Why did she fight Radahn? We'll have to talk about all of that in another video. So there is still faith. There's even this one phantom in the consecrated snowfields who has somehow puzzled out who took Miquella and even where they are. He is pointed towards the portal that takes you to Mohgwyn Palace and Mohg the Omen. So, indeed, it was the demigod Mohg who somehow broke into the Halig tree and absconded.
He probably
with
just
Miquella's
fucking walked in
infinite
there.
form.
He's a fucking
And
demigod,
it's with
bro.
him that the story ends.
Miquella
Or
was
maybe
already
that's
fucked
where the
up,
story
busy
of
fighting
truth begins.
Radahn, or Radagon.
So, if you're not familiar, Mohg is the Omen son of Godfrey and Marika, and being an Omen of royalty, he was born into a wretched mire of filth in the subterranean shunning grounds below Lanedale capital. But unlike his brother Morgoth, who reviled his accursed blood, Mohg reveled in it. and it was assumedly because of this accursed blood that he chanced a meeting with an outer god called the Mother of Truth, and as Mohg stood before her deep underground, his accursed blood erupted with fire, and he was truly besotted with the defilement that he was born into. Mohg is just one of many characters who discovers a new identity in the ways that they have been discarded by the world. And how could he not? For his defilement was validated by nothing less than an outer god. And as always, we know very little about this outer god. We know she is called the Mother of Truth, and the Formless Mother. We know that she desires wounds and bestows power upon accursed blood. Her followers can thrust their arms into her body to scatter blood flame, and followers of Mohg can share in the Lord of Blood's power and send blood flies before them. There's even been some speculation in my recent shorts and my TikToks as well that the Formless Mother is also an outer god called the Bloodstar. But the one thing that all outer gods seem to have in common is that they all require vessels to move through. So in this case, the Formless Mother's vessel was Mohg. For example, the sacred spear that he wields is a weapon, but it's also an instrument of communion, and Mohg may well be doing her bidding with his actions. These actions included him starting a new dynasty called Mohgwyn, deep below the earth, in the grounds of these ancient dynastic remains. This is a secret place, difficult to reach, and it was here that Mohg brought the infant Miquella, torn as he was from his cocoon. I mean, that's how we see him in his opening cutscene, but in-game, Miquella seems to be back with a new cocoon here. You can even see it sat upon this giant pelvic bone, which seems to be a reference to the womb of the Halig Tree woman that he was literally ripped from. And it's from the remembrance of the Bloodlord that we can learn of Mohg's intent here. He wished to raise Miquella to full godhood and become his consort, taking the role of monarch. To this end, Mohg has begun soliciting blood offerings to Miquella, and that certainly explains the state of so many who reside here. According to the Lord of Blood's exaltation talisman, he proclaimed, "Render up your offerings of blood to your lord, drench my consort's chamber, slake his cocoon's thirst. His awakening shall herald the dawn of our dynasty." And then, to return to Mohg's remembrance, it's stated that, so far, this has all been in vain, for no matter how much of his bloody bedchamber Mohg tried to share, he received no response from the young Empyrean. So maybe nothing will happen. Or maybe, according to the Pure Blood Knight's medal, it is not yet time, for Mohg yet slumbers beside the divinity. Be patient, the new dynasty is nigh. What do you think? I mean, it's kind of hard to know. Even Gideon has no clue. But something does seem to be happening to Miquella in there. He has clearly grown, for one, since being taken, so maybe his adult form is manifesting? And personally, and this is really speculation, but this reminds me a lot of Berserk, which we know Miyazaki is always inspired by. Spoiler warning, really, you should watch that show, but there's this moment at the very end of the first chapter where Griffith betrays his companions in this sacrificial ceremony of carnage and bloodshed in order to be inaugurated and reborn as a god within an egg of sorts. This really reminds
literally
me of that.
an egg.
It also reminds me
not
of
an egg of
with
sorts,
Griffith,
literally an
where
egg.
he
The
allows himself
Behelit
to
is
be
the egg of the king.
abused, basically, in order to get what he wants. So
It's literally
I
an
wonder,
egg.
what if this was also what Miquella wanted? We know that he is extremely proficient at compelling others to love him, and Mohg is clearly enraptured. We know that Miquella is an Empyrean prodigy, and we know that his sister, who knows him best, has total faith that he will return. So you'd think he's still in control of the situation somehow, but that could be a part of the tragedy, and Miquella, this benevolent being, might not have predicted this at all, and is now being completely taken advantage of. Or maybe he did intend to be taken, but he's going to get more than he bargained for with the Mother of Truth. Or maybe Miquella's fate really is long gone. There's one other thing I want to mention. There is this place called Miquella's Hideaway in the Altus Plateau, and here we can loot Amber Starlight, which Celovus mentions is the very fate of a demigod. clearly, since it's here, you'd think it's Miquella's fate, right? And then you also have to consider that the cut content that we are basing so much of this video on is very much removed from the game, because it might not fit the developer's intent. That's always possible.
Very sleepy.
So
How much
I
more
really
do we have
hope
this
you all
of this
bear that in
video?
mind, as I would really hate to promote ideas
I'm
that
gonna call
are
it here.
against the developer's vision for this
Pick
character.
this up in the morning when this is dried a
I really
little
do
bit.
think that it's a possibility that we're going to one day enter the dream of this slumbering demigod. After all, there was once a cut character called Rico who was supposed to say the following, standing before Miquella's cocoon at Mogwin Palace. He says, "Finally, I have found it. St. Trina's, no, Lord Miquella's cadaver, such that I may aid you, O Lord. So please, I hope you welcome your humble servant Rico into your dream, the world of your heart. Indeed, I beg you grant my wish, that when you transcend from Empyrean to God, allow me a place by your side." Plus, if we do get DLC, it's going to need a new Great Rune to acquire, right? That's a huge gameplay mechanic in these games, and it'd be weird if DLC came and you couldn't get more Great Runes. Apart from Miquella's Great Rune, the only one we don't know about also is Rani's Great Rune, which was allegedly cast aside. So there's always that to consider. But hopefully we get some DLC to answer these questions, or more likely we'll get DLC that will give us more questions than we started with. That's always how it seems to go, but I really hope they throw us some good curveballs with this one, as they always do. But regardless, it's always a ton of fun to speculate with you all, so if you're still listening to this extremely long video, thank you for giving me your time today. Thank you to Quelaag for reviewing the script for me. Thank you, Miss Pap, for the incredible visuals, as always. And I also want to give a sincere and really reverential shout out to Eugenia Lysa, who created the speculative visuals of St. Trina. Please follow her work in the description. She's one of the most talented artists that I've ever known. And yeah, thank you, as always, of course, for watching my videos, and I'll see you next time.
Good videos. Really good videos. Really good videos. Jeez. Alright, so here, let me show you guys more angles of this thing. It looks a lot better in person. It looks less like Sneak King in person. But we're going to finish it up tomorrow. I feel like if we can get the beard shit going a little bit better, it'll be more obvious what the fuck this is. Not just some weird mix of Sneak King and Jesus. Alright, well, thank y'all for hanging out. We're gonna raid Bendy. So be nice. Alright? Boom.
Oh, abracadabra! Oh, raiding party! Abracadabra, thank you so much.